steel, firearms, and the Industrialists crossing into another world. Greetings, fellow multiversal adventurers. It's an honor to have you back in this saga that has us all hooked. Official channel statement: this story is 100% epic fiction. So please don't attempt real magic, the results aren't guaranteed and insurance won't cover it. The rights to this masterpiece belong entirely to its brilliant original author. We are just a barge sharing it with you. Do you want to keep being part of this amazing community? Join our ninja army of subscribers on YouTube and give this content a like. And for true fans, our Patreon has exclusive ninjutsu waiting for you. Chapter 551 Night Challenge. Since joining the Valen family's conspiracy to rebel, Fergus had always believed he was fighting to restore Arden's ancient and traditional order. Yes, Paul Gleman so mistreated the gentry, disrespecting them, humiliating them, oppressing them, exploiting them relentlessly, and even trying to take back their power. The once peaceful and beautiful pastoral landscape was being ruthlessly torn apart step by step. Moreover, the Lord was surrounded by a circle of cunning, sycophantic merchants who used money to corrupt Arden's once simple social atmosphere, causing peasants to abandon their fields and flee to the cities. If this continued, Arda would gradually degenerate into an irreversible abyss. And he, Sir Fergus, as a son of this land, had to stand up and save it all, to eliminate the root of all this chaos. Paul Gleman, before Arda became beyond redemption, even though he was the lord he served. Gleman had fallen and embraced evil. Now, however, facing his former squire, now the infantry battalion commander, Carter Hawley, whom he had once only looked up to, Fergus finally understood his true feelings and unleashed the resentment that had long been buried deep within him. He raised his sword, its sharp edge pointing at the squire who had once been unworthy of his attention, and roared hoarsely, "Hawley, you lowly squire, you only reached your position by sucking up to Bryce. What right do you have to speak ill of me? Come, if you think you deserve this position, then draw your weapon, follow the ancient tradition, and have a one-on-one nightly duel with me." Fergus's mount snorted, its nostrils spewing white smoke, as if in taunting them. However, Hawley ignored Fergus's challenge and said, "Sir Fergus, you are, after all, a knight personally appointed by Lord Gleman. I don't want things to get too ugly. Don't you want to consider surrendering?" "Surrender? Ho ha ho ha," Fergus laughed as if mocking them. "To whom do I surrender? To a dead man? Or to a pile of ashes?" It's utterly ridiculous. He was acting like a madman, not just to Carter Hawley, but to everyone around him who could hear him, shouting even louder than before, "Your beloved Lord Paul Gleman has long been burned to ashes in this fire, not even a bone can be found. And now you want me to surrender? It's laughable. On the contrary, you, as the army of Arda, should have turned against him long ago, abandoned that hypocrite whose body and soul have fallen into hell, and pledged allegiance to the new Lord. If you make the right choice, I'm willing to overlook your rudeness and say a few good words for you to the new Lord, so that you won't be driven out of Arda like a pack of stray dogs." Although he guessed that Earl Gleman was probably doomed, hearing it from Fergus's mouth still felt like a heavy blow to Lieutenant Colonel Hawley's heart. After Fergus finished speaking, Lieutenant Colonel Hawley looked at him as if he were a delusional patient, his gaze filled with disgust, hatred, and a hint of pity. "What's wrong with you, Fergus? Even if the new Lord ascends the throne, his first priority will be to punish you traitors to appease Lord Gryle's soul. How could he possibly allow you to speak before him?" "No. You know nothing," Fergus interrupted Lieutenant Colonel Hawley before he could finish. "Poor wretches. Let me tell you, at this moment, Lackherd is already under our control. The new Lord will only be recognized by us loyal subjects. He will set things right and restore Gryle's many misdeeds to the correct path." "Ho ha ho ha," Fergus then burst into uncontrollable laughter again. "What did you say?" Major Cobb, the instructor, was shocked by Fergus's words. "Lackherd is already..." Lieutenant Colonel Hawley raised his riding crop in front of him, stopping the major from speaking further. He said mockingly, "HMPH, just the ramblings of a traitor in dire straits, trying to create chaos among us to save his own life. Don't believe him. You actually think of me as so despicable." Hawley's words enraged Fergus, who had been laughing moments before. Although Lieutenant Colonel Hawley said this, his heart was in turmoil. Were the traitors trying to operate on two fronts? Success in either would cause immense chaos in Arda. In Barber Village, if the Lord was assassinated, the consequences would be dire. In Lakeside Town, if a new Lord was successfully elected, it would mean that key departments of the government were under their control, and a portion of the army might pledge allegiance to the new lord, causing a major split in Arda. The most terrifying scenario would be if they succeeded in both fronts, creating an irreversible situation. And in Barber Village, where he was, at least for now, the Lord's fate seemed grim. Damn it. After cursing inwardly, Lieutenant Colonel Hawley decided to eliminate Fergus first. On one hand, it was out of loyalty to Earl Greyman, and Fergus was the one directly responsible for the Earl's death, so he wanted revenge. On the other hand, even if the traitors gained power and the new lord they elected succeeded to the throne, he could claim ignorance of what happened in Lakeshire. In this situation, avenging his former master was perfectly reasonable. Loyalty was always praised, the greatest political correctness of the time. Of course, Lieutenant Colonel Hawley's greatest hope, or rather his deduction, was that the political and military systems Earl Greyman had built up over the years were definitely not something a group of guys like Fergus could overthrow, and Lakeshire was most likely still under the control of the Loyalists. In front of Hawley, Fergus was still taunting him, "Come on, Carter Hawley. Since you don't believe me, then accept my challenge. Even if you, in your lowly status, don't have the status of a knight, at least fight me like a man." He brandished his sword, his expression full of mockery. Hawley held up 3 fingers on his left hand. "Fergus, I'm giving you one last chance. Surrender now." 3, 2, Hawley's repeated rejections of his challenge ignited Fergus's boundless rage. This clown before him, it was already an immense honor for Fergus, a knight, to extend a duel invitation. How dare he refuse? With a roar, he spurred his horse forward, brandishing his sword and charging at Hawley. Resentment, jealousy, hatred, and anger, all these negative emotions clouded Fergus's judgment, making him forget the cold muzzle of the gun pointed at him. Bang! A gunshot rang out, and the knight fell from his horse. Lieutenant Colonel Hawley blew the gunpowder from the muzzle, saying with disdain, "An old relic like you should have faded into obscurity long ago." Fergus didn't die. The lieutenant colonel had aimed at his horse, but when he fell, his head struck a rock. If only he hadn't left Lake Town. That was his last thought before he lost consciousness. Chapter 552 Confirming Safety. In the instant Fergus fell from his horse, his men tried to flee, but the soldiers opened fire, shooting them down one by one. "Tie them up. Tie them all up. Leave some alive first," Lieutenant Colonel Hawley ordered the surviving enemies. By this time, the battle by the river was nearing its end. After a few volleys of gunfire, the Alda troops, ambushed in the forest, charged out at the sound of bugles, bayonets gleaming, and thrust them at the terrified rebels. The surviving rebels, untouched by bullets, had already lost all morale and organization. The soldiers captured them easily. They were tied up in 10 groups with ropes. "Commander! Commander!" A loud shout came from afar, the voice filled with surprise, attracting Lieutenant Colonel Hawley's attention. He saw 2 men running towards him and called out from a distance, "What is it?" The men running towards him shouted, "The Lord's Guards. We've found the Lord's Guards." "What?" Lieutenant Colonel Hawley and his political instructor, Cobb, were shocked and immediately spurred their horses to gallop over. It was Company Commander Mesa, who had just been directing his company in the woods. Beside Mesa was another man. Lieutenant Colonel Hawley looked closely and saw that the man's uniform was that of a Lord's Guard. This guard was soaking wet, his shoes and trousers covered in mud, and his upper garment was covered in leaves and grass seeds, as if he had just crawled out of the bushes. His hair was disheveled, probably from smoke, and his face was blackened, making the whites of his eyes particularly noticeable. "How is Lord Gleman?" he asked urgently, ignoring the man's heavy breathing. "Lord Gleman is unharmed," the guard replied, still panting. Upon hearing the news, the lieutenant colonel and his men were both surprised and delighted. "What's your name?" "Stefano." "My lord, my name is Stefano," Lieutenant Colonel Hawley ordered his men. "Quickly, give him some water and food." Knowing his lord was safe, a great weight was lifted from his heart, and he didn't rush to question the weary guard before him. Stefano simply took the water pouch and gulped down several large mouthfuls. He had eaten some food before setting off from the Lord's camp for reconnaissance, so he wasn't hungry, and he had drunk water then, but he had felt thirsty while watching the battle nearby. He and another companion were ordered to scout towards Barber Village. During their journey, they encountered a small group of 10 rebels approaching the camp. After a brief discussion, his companion returned to camp to report, while Stefano bypassed them and continued towards Barber Village. Continuing along the river, they soon encountered an ambush by the 8th Infantry Battalion against the rebels. Confused about the situation, he hid nearby to observe. Seeing the rebels being soundly defeated, he confirmed that the army loyal to the Lord had arrived. He remained where he was, continuing to observe and intending to make contact with the army. Only after the battle was over did Stefano emerge from his hiding place and call out to the soldiers cleaning up the battlefield. Initially, he was almost mistaken for stragglers, with several muskets aimed at him. He had to cautiously approach them with his hands raised before explaining his identity. Then, the delighted company commander Messa took Stefano to Lieutenant Colonel Holly. Stefano knew what they wanted to ask him, and wiped his mouth with his sleeve, saying, "Lieutenant Colonel. Ah, you must be Lieutenant Colonel Holly." "Yes, I am Kurt Holly, commander of the 8th Infantry Battalion." "Excellent. I was ordered by Lord Victor to scout out the situation in Barber Village, and I didn't expect to meet you here. Go in that direction." Stefano pointed back, 2 miles further on, and you'll reach Palace's Valley, where Lord Gleman's camp is located. Many brothers were wounded, but Lord Gleman himself is unharmed. May the Lord of Light forever bless him. "But how did you manage to escape such a huge fire?" Stefano laughed and replied, "The fire had just reached the edge of our camp when it started raining heavily, so lucky." Everyone who heard Stefano's words, whether Lieutenant Colonel Holly, Major Cobb, or their men, marveled at this, some even believing that divine intervention must have been helping Earl Gleman. Holly patted the guard's shoulder happily. "Stefano, you'll have to trouble yourself a little longer and take us to Lord Gleman. I think Lord Gleman will definitely give you a long leave afterwards so you can rest for a while." Stefano replied without hesitation, "It's my duty, Lieutenant Colonel. Please come with me. Oh, by the way, a 10-man rebel squad just sneaked into the Lord's camp, but my comrades have already gone back to inform them." "Ah. Then let's hurry up and set off." Less than an hour later, Lieutenant Colonel Holly and Major Cobb met their lord in Palace's Valley. "We're late, Lord Gleman, please punish us." The two knelt on the ground to beg for forgiveness as soon as they saw Paul. No. Paul immediately stepped forward and helped them up. He was also overjoyed at this moment. With the 8th Infantry Battalion, his safety was finally guaranteed. "Actually, I didn't expect you to arrive so quickly. I thought I wouldn't see you until tomorrow." "No, this afternoon." "Haha, just so you know, this isn't sarcastic, it's true," Lieutenant Colonel Holly explained. "Sir, we asked the mayor of the area where we're stationed to help us gather enough horses, and we rode all the way here at breakneck speed." "I see," Paul understood. He suddenly realized that he should have a unit that could be quickly mobilized, like a real cavalry. But that seemed very expensive, so Paul shook his head, putting the idea out of his mind for now. Holly asked, "My lord, your guards mentioned a small rebel squad." Paul waved his hand. "They've been wiped out. I guess Fergus left them behind to confirm I'm still alive." Lieutenant Colonel Holly nodded. "That's good. Sigh, I never imagined Sir Fergus would stoop so low, ain't I?" HMPH, hatred flashed across Paul's face. "Never mind him." Holly's expression suddenly changed. "Lord Griles, there's something very urgent I need to tell you. Lakeside Town, there might be rebels active there too." Ah. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 553 Acting Lord. As the first rays of sunlight touched Lake Town, the tense and oppressive atmosphere that had accumulated overnight did not dissipate. Guards stood watch at every intersection, mostly militiamen who had learned to firearms the day before. The militiamen, both nervous and excited, observed their surroundings intently. Despite not having slept, they were all energetic. After the mobilization the previous night, these young men felt they were shouldering a sacred and weighty mission, to rescue Arda from the conspirators. The once bustling streets of Lake Town were deserted today. Only those with urgent matters ventured out cautiously. Fortunately, aside from a few restricted areas where entry and exit were prohibited, and leaving the city was forbidden, they encountered no major difficulties. Inside the Lord's Manor, the high-ranking officials of the council, summoned throughout the night, had also not slept. They stood in 2 rows in the castle's forecourt, seemingly awaiting some important figure. A carriage emerged from a side alley and slowly made its way north along the city's central avenue towards the Lord's Manor. A guard of mounted men flanked it on each side, a conspicuous display against the otherwise deserted street. About 20 minutes later, the carriage entered the castle gates and stopped in the courtyard. A knight dismounted. This was Lieutenant Bulgan, the training officer authorized by the general staff to oversee martial law in the city, and the militia gathered in Lake Town were under his command. Bulgan approached the carriage, opened the door, and announced loudly, "Lord Julio, please alight. The officials of the council are waiting for you." A fair-skinned hand gently tapped the door frame, and a well-dressed middle-aged man stepped out. He wore a dark gold robe, was of medium build, had a meticulously groomed beard, and a slight double chin. The man whom Bulgan addressed as Lord Julio had a face full of exhaustion and sadness, and his whole being exuded a listlessness, as if he hadn't slept all night. Everyone in the courtyard turned to look at him. Old Ford, the head of the state council, slowly stepped forward and bowed slightly to him. "Lord Julio, Alice," Julio sighed, his voice hoarse. "Chief Steward Ford, I never expected this to happen, much less to see you again in this state. Just last week I was strolling in this courtyard with Lord Gleman, and now, Alice, please accept my condolences, please accept my condolences as well." Chief Steward Ford's voice was equally hoarse. "I suppose Bulgan has already told you why he summoned you here." "Yes, he also told me about the danger Arda is facing. Since the Lord of Light has placed me at the crossroads of Arda's fate, I will refrain from any sentimental words. I, Julio Webster, am willing to shoulder this responsibility and restore the Gleman name." As Julio spoke, Old Ford kept watching him. His tone was resolute, but his eyes revealed some tension, hesitation, and lack of confidence. This combination, ironically, dispelled some of Old Ford's doubts. Julio was also looking at Old Ford. He reached out and grasped the hand of the head of the state council. "Please help me. Let's work together to overcome this difficult time." Old Ford nodded gently. "We will, Lord Julio. Now, please come into the hall. We urgently need to send letters to the surrounding lords in the name of the Gleman family to deter those families with ill intentions, and at the same time, to bring in the friendly families for our assistance." "I understand," Julio replied. "You speak, and I will write. However, we must also notify Arda, Byron, and Emden as soon as possible that the new, acting lord has been established, to avoid any problems with the implementation of our orders." Old Ford said, "Of course. The ministers of the state council, including myself, have already written a joint letter to announce your new status to the local authorities. Lord Garnard has also sent someone over." Next, Old Ford introduced the acting lord, who was standing in the courtyard, to Julio one by one, even though he already knew many of them. After the introductions, the officials followed the two into the Lord's Hall, and everyone took their seats again. They discussed who might harbor ill intentions towards Arda, who might side with him, and how to write letters to different people. Then they discussed how to deal with the rebellion in Barber Village. The final conclusion was to wait until the 4 fully fledged infantry battalions were recalled from their field training, then launch a swift attack to wipe out the rebels and avenge Paul Gleman. At the same time, martial law would continue in Lakeside Town until all the lurking rebels within the city were apprehended. Acting Lord Julio and his officials met until nearly noon before having pen and ink prepared to begin writing letters. It was at this moment that someone approached Lieutenant Bulgan, who was also present and the sole military representative, and quietly reported that an army had appeared outside the city. Butler Philip, with heavy steps, quietly left a meeting. After greeting Acting Lord Julio with the officials of the Council of State, he felt he had no desire to remain there any longer. Grief filled his entire being. Rebellion, border troubles, these headaches were left to the officials appointed by Paul. He hoped they wouldn't disappoint their young master. He, after all, was merely the steward of the Griles family. Philip had made up his mind to stay in this manner until his young master's revenge was achieved, then resign and return to his hometown to spend the rest of his life. He had no interest in continuing to serve Julio, the heir to the Griles name. To Philip, after Paul's departure, the true Griles family ceased to exist. Julio was merely a figurehead bearing the Griles name. Philip wandered aimlessly through the castle, sometimes having the illusion that Paul was beside him, but each time the illusion shattered immediately. Sigh, he pushed open the door to Paul's office, where he often handled official business. It was filled with books and documents. He wondered how the new master of the castle would deal with them. Beep beep beep, beep beep beep. A sound came from the window. The old butler turned his head and saw a large parrot perched on the windowsill, tapping on the glass with its beak. This parrot? It looked somewhat familiar. The old butler had a strange feeling about it. Chapter 554 Chaos. Lieutenant Colonel James Walton, commander of the 6th Infantry Battalion of the Arda Army stationed on the border of Emden, was quite frustrated. Early that morning, after his usual routine inspection of the soldiers' morning training, he returned to his quarters to prepare breakfast. Just as he took his first bite of bread, he received a telegram from the signal tower in Lakemore. Lakemore was a viscountcy of the Hulson family, formerly one of Emden's vassal states, and the telegram was from Viscount Hulson. The telegram's contents shocked Lieutenant Colonel Walton. Count Bijita Basil from next door had suddenly led his army into Lakemore, claiming to be pursuing a band of bandits. Viscount Hulson, with few men under his command, was unable to stop him and was confined to his castle. Although Count Basil's army had not committed any acts of violence after entering Lakemore, they were continuing their advance towards Emden. After the War of the Usurpers ended, Paul brought Emden, directly ruled by the Kent family, under the administration of the council. However, he was remarkably lenient towards the Kent vassals. After requiring them to reswear allegiance to the Gleman family, he allowed them to retain their own territories, granting them autonomy in all aspects except that their laws must not contradict the fundamental principles established by the Arda Lords' Court, and that they must join the customs union. Making these minor lords reswear allegiance was effortless. As vassals of the Kent family, they had contributed both manpower and resources in the war, fighting alongside their former lord, Maltz Kent, until his death, thus fulfilling their oaths. Now that Maltz Kent and his heirs were gone, the original oaths had lost their basis for validity. At this point, faced with a choice of whether to become Paul Gleman's enemy and betray him, or to become his vassals and curry favor, each person made a rational choice. Viscount Herson was one of the more proactive among the surrendered lords, but his enthusiasm wasn't like the others, fawning over Paul or kissing his boots during audiences. Herson's proactivity lay in keeping his territory in sync with Lakeshire, ensuring that laws, regulations, taxes, and even things like the town hall and police station were all in place, so that an ordinary Arda resident wouldn't feel out of place after moving to Lakemore. Furthermore, Herson sent his nephew, the Viscount only had a daughter, and his nephew was his heir, to study at Wise Academy in Lakeshire. By traditional standards, this was tantamount to hostage-taking, though Paul didn't seem to care much. To others, Viscount Herson appeared more like an administrator dispatched by Lakeshire than a lord. His proactivity paid off handsomely. Paul always showed him favor at the lords' gatherings in Lakeshire. More importantly, Lakeside Town invested heavily in his territory, building roads, factories, and mining. Lakeside Town provided all the capital, equipment, and technology needed. All he had to do was contribute land and manpower, without spending a penny. Profits were split 50-50. Through this route, the Herson family's wealth accumulated at a rate that made others envious, much faster than before when they had to extract money from the poor peasants. Viscount Lakemore set a good example, and many vassals began to emulate the Herson family's methods to varying degrees. Even if they couldn't attract investment from Lakeside Town, well, many of Alda's practices were still good examples of how to develop a territory. In particular, Viscount Brightshawn, who ruled Beethoven, suffered a severe penalty during the War of the Usurpers. His family's wealth, accumulated over generations, vanished instantly, forcing them to borrow money to survive. At one point, Viscount Shawn even considered selling his territory to his current vassal, Earl Greyman. In short, Lakemore served as a model for Lacahert, and with the Herson family now vassals of the Greyman family and under Lacahert's protection, Lieutenant Colonel Walton couldn't ignore the situation. The colonel quickly ate a few bites of food and ordered his guards to gather all the officers in the battalion, intending to inform them before leading his troops to Lakemore to block Earl Basil's army. Earl Basil had also participated in the War of the Usurpers, belonging to the Anti-Kent Alliance, but only joining in the latter half of the war. He was currently negotiating with the customs union, wanting to join but disagreeing on the distribution of common customs duties, and therefore had not yet been accepted as a formal member. This was a lord with a neutral relationship with Lacahert, but entering the Gleman family's territory without prior notice was going too far. Lieutenant Colonel Walton decided to use overwhelming force to make him back down, first trying to reason with him, and if that failed, then war would be the only option. Lieutenant Colonel Walton truly looked down on the armies of other territories in the Northwest Bay. According to regulations, the lieutenant colonel first sent an encrypted telegram to Lacahert explaining the reason for the operation. Then, things started to frustrate Lieutenant Colonel Walton. First, Lacahert quickly replied, but the content was unbelievable. It instructed him to allow Earl Basil's army to pass, stating that Basil had come at the invitation of Lacahert, and the sender was the general staff. The military's communication codes had recently been changed, and encryption was end-to-end, so Basil didn't doubt the authenticity of the telegram. But if foreign troops were invited to enter their territory, shouldn't the 6th Infantry Battalion, which was stationed there, be notified first? What if a misunderstanding occurred? Despite his doubts, Lieutenant Colonel Basil decided to carry out orders and planned to send several guides to Count Basil's army. However, he then received a telegram whose contents sent a chill down his spine. Lakeside Town was under rebel control, and any information from there should be disregarded. The telegram was addressed to all battalions, meaning every battalion commander would receive such a telegram. In particular, this telegram was from Area 51, sent by Chief of Staff Schroeder. As one of only 8 battalion commanders in the Arda Army, James Walton certainly knew about Area 51, but why was Lord Schroeder there, and what did he mean by Lakeside Town being under rebel control? Lieutenant Colonel Walton and his officers were thrown into utter confusion by these 2 telegrams. Which should they believe? Lakeside Town? Or Area 51? Chapter 555 Exposure. The people in the Lord's Mansion Hall were still there, but the seat where Paul had previously sat was now occupied by the acting Lord, Julio. He held a quill pen and quickly wrote a letter on paper, occasionally pausing to discuss the details with the others. He was in no hurry to express his own opinions, always responding with elho when others presented their views, behaving very humbly. The Grand Steward, Old Ford, was holding a letter the acting Lord had just written, scrutinizing each word for its appropriateness. At this moment, someone quietly entered the hall. It was the butler, Philip, who had left dejectedly earlier. The old butler approached the Grand Steward, who, sensing someone's presence, turned and looked at Philip. Grand Steward Ford had known the old butler had left, and he very much wanted to leave his seat to comfort his old friend of decades, but he had more important matters to attend to, so he had to put aside his emotions. Seeing him return, he gently asked, "Oh, Philip, what brings you here, Steward?" Philip said softly but openly, as if afraid of disturbing others, "I was just sorting through young Master Paul's belongings in his study. There's a safe there with a combination lock known only to him and you, so I need your help. I think we should make room for the new lord as soon as possible." "Oh, that safe," Old Ford blinked. "Actually, there's nothing inside, just some financial statements. I'll go up and take them down for Lord Julio to review." "Colleagues, Lord Julio, I'll take my leave for a moment." With that, he stood up. "Please go ahead," Julio said, sitting beside Old Ford. He had heard every word of their conversation without suspicion. Of those present, only the Lord Secretary, Bernard, was slightly taken aback, but his expression quickly returned to normal, unnoticed by the others. Old Ford followed Philip upstairs, one after the other, without a word, until they reached Paul's office. Just as Steward Ford entered, Philip closed the door. "What happened?" Steward Ford asked Philip impatiently. He had no idea about the combination to the safe in the Lord's office, and Butler Philip knew he didn't know it either. He had been very confused when he heard Philip's words, but thankfully, the steward's mind reacted faster than his facial muscles, and he didn't show any noticeable expression. "Bulgan is the traitor lurking in Lakeshire," Butler Philip blurted out the shocking news to Steward Ford. Why do you say that?" Steward Ford's beard twitched, though he had also had his suspicions. Butler Philip handed him a small note. Lady Laddie's pet parrot brought back a letter from Lord Griles, saying that the Warren family, from Bulgan, were involved in the attack on him. Upon hearing Paul's news, Steward Ford's eyes widened, and he grabbed Philip's collar. "What about Lord Griles?" "Lord Griles is still struggling under the protection of his guards, but the parrot has already delivered his plea for help to the nearest 8th Infantry Battalion." Butler Philip spoke with concern, but his face was no longer as ashen. "So Lord Griles might still be alive." Old Ford's heart, dormant with despair, began to beat again. "Yes, entirely possible." Butler Philip's tone became firm. "Wait, you mean the parrot? It's right there." Butler Philip pointed to the south side of the room. Steward Ford turned around and, sure enough, it was Saoirse's parrot. He had seen Laddie play with the bird many times in her spare time. Steward Ford immediately finished reading the note Philip had handed him. Good. The steward's wrinkled face twisted with anger as a complete conspiracy gradually took shape in his mind. First, he would try his best to lure the Lord away from his center of power and separate him from his subjects, then seize the opportunity to assassinate him outside. Then, using his position, he would control the militia who had come for training, spread the news that the Lord had died in a rebellion, create the illusion of a foreign invasion, which might actually be true, and disguise himself as a loyalist to make the already overwhelmed officials acknowledge the new lord they had recommended. And, coincidentally, the garrison in Lake Town was not there at this time, a perfect opportunity. With a thud, Steward Ford slammed the note on the table. We must act immediately, we cannot let these traitors succeed. Philip, how many guards are left in the Lord's manor? There are still more than 30 in the castle. Philip pondered for a moment, stroking his beard, and said, 30 is enough. Find a few skilled men to come back to the hall with me later. We'll take control of this Bulgan. Judging from his behavior last night, he's the leader of the rebel group lurking in Lacquer Town. Philip asked, what if his accomplices outside try to rescue him? Or what if something else happens? His accomplices have gone mad and don't care about his life or death. They now have nearly 2,000 militiamen under their control. This old Ford calmed down after being asked this question. Inside the hall. What did you say? Bulgan almost shouted, though he managed to hold back, but his loss of composure was still noticed. Just now, one of his confidants ran into the Lord's manor and whispered a few words to him. But these words were undoubtedly a bolt from the blue for Bulgan. An army had appeared outside Lacquer Town, and its size was less than a battalion. Even more alarming was the fact that this army possessed muskets and cannons, undoubtedly the regular army of Arda, given their banners proclaiming themselves as Arda's troops and Scrutter. But, the 4 infantry battalions in the middle of the lake should be far, far away by now. Even if they received the news and immediately turned back towards the town, it would be impossible for them to arrive so quickly. Where did Scrutter find this army? Bulgan couldn't fathom it. Scrutter. Bulgan hadn't expected that this chief of staff, who had fled overnight, would ultimately bring him such a huge problem. He had to immediately begin organizing a defense, Bulgan concluded. And he had to go personally, otherwise, given the nature of those militiamen, they would immediately flee to the other side upon seeing Chief of Staff Scrutter. Many of them had seen the Chief of Staff before. Chapter 556 Exposure 2. Just as Steward Ford and Butler Philip were at their wits' end in Paul's office on the second floor, a guard knocked on the door. Sirs, Lieutenant Warren said he had urgent military business and left. What? The two were startled, hurriedly leaving the office and rushing down the corridor to look down at the stairwell. Sure enough, Bulgan Warren's seat was empty. Philip said worriedly, urgent military business? What happened? Steward Ford, somewhat frustrated and regretful, said, perhaps we should have been more decisive and subdued him in time. A whooshing sound was heard, and the parrot that had been in the office flew down the corridor. It seemed to have flown out the window while old Ford and Philip were discussing their strategy. Had it returned? The parrot flapped its wings, landing with a flutter on the stair railing, its beak open. Scrod. The army is here. Scrod. The army is here, it must be said. The bird Roddy Sisha kept was truly amazing. The parrot was mimicking human speech, albeit incoherently, but the two could completely understand its meaning. If it were an ordinary parrot, Chief of Staff Ford and Philip might have only been puzzled. However, this was no ordinary parrot, because its owner was no ordinary woman. If they were not mistaken, Chief of Staff Scrod had returned with the army. Old Ford thought for a moment and said to Philip, Bulgan said he had urgent military business to attend to. Is this it? I suspect Scrod noticed Bulgan's unusual movements from the beginning and promptly left Lakeside Town to find reinforcements elsewhere, and now he's leading his army back. Philip didn't know about Area 51, but old Ford, as the head of the state council, did. Unable to contact the 4 infantry battalions that were out training in the field in time, it was highly likely that Scrod had rushed to Area 51 overnight to find that army. Shouldn't we help the Chief of Staff? Hearing that loyal troops had returned, Philip was overjoyed, his lips trembling as he spoke. The most effective way is to control this castle. If we succeed, it will throw Bulgan and his men into chaos. With enemies both inside and outside, it will greatly affect morale. You're right. Let's go and gather the guards now. Tell Ruth. He was the former captain of the guards. The two hurried down the stairs and returned to the hall where the meeting was being held. However, a sudden change occurred. A group of about 100 people jogged into the castle's forecourt. Judging from their attire, some were militiamen, others police. Old Ford and Philip's hearts tightened. What was Bulgan up to? A man burst into the Lord's mansion hall. Bilal? What are you doing here? Seeing the newcomer, Ruth Hayden, the head of public security who was also attending the meeting, asked suspiciously. This man was Bilal McReynolds, the captain of the 2nd Detachment, and also his subordinate. However, after martial law was declared in Lacahurt, all the city's police force had gone to cooperate with the military. Commander Hayden, gentlemen, Bilal McReynolds said respectfully, I have very bad news. The rebels have begun their attack on Lacahurt, and Lieutenant Bulgan has gone to organize the defense. Hearing this, the unsuspecting officials exchanged bewildered glances. They'd arrived so quickly? Old Ford and Philip cursed inwardly. They were still slandering those warriors who had served their lord, truly turning black into white. The head of the state council asked, in such an urgent moment, why aren't you helping Bulgan? What are you doing at the Lord's mansion? Bilal explained, the Lord's mansion is such an important place, naturally, its protection is paramount. Commander Bulgan fears that some rioters in the city might take advantage of the chaos to attack the Lord's mansion, so he sent us to strengthen security here. Also, given the current chaotic situation, the lieutenant said that all of you must remain inside the castle. The police force in Lakeside Town is insufficient, so we have no choice but to have you stay here for concentrated protection. Philip was furious, but dared not show it on his face. Clearly, he's here to spy on us, that bastard Bulgan. The others were also complaining bitterly. After a night and a morning of meetings, they thought they could finally get a good night's sleep. Old Ford stroked his beard calmly and said, in that case, why not bring everyone's families to the Lord's mansion as well? It would be better to look after them together. If there are rioters in the city supporting the rebels, they'd be in danger even in their own homes. Philip was startled, then realized that Steward Ford was going to fight to the death. After bringing the officials' families to the Lord's manor, and having fallen out with Bulgan, everyone had no more worries. Leaving them outside would have meant that even if they could control the castle, they would still be holding a large number of hostages. However, Bilal McReynolds was unaware that Steward Ford already knew the truth about the rebellion. He assumed the old man before him was still part of their script. A barely perceptible sneer flashed in the police captain's eyes. You said it yourself, Lord Ford, I'll take care of it immediately. He bowed slightly to acting Lord Julio as a sign of respect, then turned and left the hall. After watching Bilal leave, Steward Ford turned to the head of the public security department and called out, Ruth, come here for a moment, I have something to say to you. Before becoming the head of the public security department, Ruth Hayden commanded the Lord's Guards and was the most physically capable person there. About 2 hours later, the officials' families had all been brought into the castle. Close the gates. After the last person entered the castle, Zane, the militia captain who had come to the Lord's manor for security, ordered the castle gates closed. For some reason, Zane felt uneasy. Lieutenant Bulgan had said there were lurking rebels in the city, but since martial law began, the militia of Tata Town had been assigned to patrol the streets. Zane had been leading his men on patrol since dawn, but had never seen or heard anything unusual. Could it be that the rebels had been frightened into hiding after seeing that the authorities were prepared? What kind of rebellion could they possibly have with such cowardice? Even if they didn't dare to start a full-scale uprising, couldn't they at least secretly set a few fires? Lord Griles had actually been assassinated by such a bunch of cowards. It was really. Just as Zane was lost in thought, a commotion suddenly erupted from the Lord's Manor Hall, mixed with screams of terror. What happened? Zane, his nerves on edge, immediately thought of something terrible. Could it be that rebels had infiltrated the Lord's Manor and were killing people in the castle hall? He had just been complaining about them. Ugh! Zane stomped his foot angrily on the ground and called to his brothers, come on, let's go see. Chapter 557 Kidnapping. Zane led the militia brothers from Tata village and rushed into the front hall of the Lord's mansion. The front hall doors were open. The scene inside shocked them. A burly man, seemingly the head of the public security department, was tightly gripping the neck of someone with arms as thick as an average person's thigh. The person he was controlling was none other than Billy McReynolds, the police captain who had brought him to the Lord's mansion for security. McReynolds was in a bad situation. He was being held like a chick in the arms of Ruth Hayden, who was 2 heads taller than him. His hands were tightly gripping the strong arms that were gripping his neck, and he was trying desperately to pry the arms off his neck. However, Ruth Hayden's arms were unmoving, as if they were made of cast steel. The veins on McReynolds' temples were bulging, and he was clearly using all his strength. Beads of sweat rolled down his forehead. The guards of the Lord's Manor tightly surrounded Ruth Hayden and the other officials, their expressions tense as they vigilantly surveyed their surroundings. The police, who had rushed in slightly earlier than the militia, stared in disbelief at the incredible scene. If it were just Ruth Hayden alone, he might be a rebel lurking in the city, but, judging from the situation before him, he carefully observed Sir Ford, the head of the Council of State, and Philip, the old steward of the Lord's Manor. They stood beside Ruth Hayden, their expressions showing no panic, but rather a resolute gaze upon the others. Steward Ford and Steward Philip, a traitor? How could that be? Although Zane didn't live in Lakeshire, he had heard of these two men. By all accounts, they should be Earl Greyman's most trusted and relied upon men. There was no way they would betray him. As for the other officials, their reactions were no better than the police and militia. They were also extremely shocked by what had happened around them. Release Lord McReynolds. This is a rebellion, several policemen shouted at their head of public security. Hearing his companion's shouts, Lucas, standing in the police ranks, frowned deeply. He could tell that these officers were among McReynolds' most trusted men. But they were now facing Lord Ruth Hayden, the head of all the police, and the head of the government, and the Lord Steward seemed to be on Hayden's side as well. Ruth Hayden's eyes widened, his former captain of the guard's gaze quite intimidating. Listen up, everyone, he roared. The Lord's mansion hall was designed with an echo effect, and Ruth Hayden's voice sounded like thunder to everyone. Bulgan Varon and Billow McReynolds are the traitors, don't listen to his nonsense. Billow McReynolds, his face flushed from being gripped by the arm, still managed to shout through Richie, get me out of this traitor's clutches. The militiamen were at a loss, while nearly half of the police raised their guns at Ruth Hayden. They too had been armed, but the manor guards protecting Ruth Hayden immediately raised their weapons as well, confronting the police. Put your guns down, Ruth Hayden glared angrily, tightening his grip on McReynolds' arm. McReynolds winced in pain and quickly told his men, put down your guns. Put down your guns. The policemen with guns exchanged glances and silently lowered their weapons. Steward Ford? What's going on? The officials surrounded by guards calmed down from their initial panic. Cecil, Hansel, Bernard, and the others all looked at old Ford, seeking an answer. Listen to me, everyone. Old Ford, the head of the state council, cleared his throat heavily before speaking. Everyone in the hall, except for the guards, turned to him. We just received news from the Lord. Yes, that's right. Our Lord, Earl Paul Gleman, is still alive. He was indeed attacked by traitors, and among those traitors are the Warren and McReynolds families, from which Bulgan and Billiller originated. Whoa! A chorus of surprised exclamations rippled through the hall. Cecil reacted. So, the traitors Bulgan mentioned are themselves. Yes, Butler Philip confirmed. Billow McReynolds, now restrained, was sweating profusely, his heart pounding with fear and panic. He couldn't fathom how old Ford and Philip had received the news. All communication routes between Lakeside Town and the outside world must have been cut off. Could they possibly have telepathy? He was supposed to be guarding these hostages, but he'd become a hostage himself. Militia brothers. Police brothers, Ruth Hayden shouted at them, wake up to these traitors' lies. While the Lakeside Town garrison was away, Bulgan used his authority to deceive the militia who came for training. Billa also lied to his police subordinates, and perhaps they have people in other departments too. They spread the news of the Lord's assassination, though it wasn't entirely false, plunging the city into chaos, seizing control of the situation, and even installing their own puppet lord. He glared at Julio, still seated in the Lord's seat, as he finished speaking. The acting lord, who had been so composed, was trembling uncontrollably, two guards holding him down on either shoulder. It's not my fault. I really didn't know Bulgan was the traitor. Uriel, drenched in sweat, howled miserably, his voice echoing through the hall, but no one paid him any attention. Ho-ha, Billiller McReynolds burst into laughter, though everyone could hear the underlying weakness in his bravado. Too late. Too late. You know, too late. Tyrant Paul Gleman is finished. We've effectively won more than half the battle. If you could recognize the situation, surrendering now would be the right choice. Ruth punched him hard in the stomach, and Billiller wilted like a frostbitten eggplant. Don't listen to the traitor's nonsense. Lord Gleman is safe and sound. The 8th Infantry Battalion has him under protection, Old Ford righteously refuted, though this was merely his guess. Moreover, Chief of Staff Scrutter recognized the traitor's plot in time and left the city overnight to find reinforcements. He has now led an army back. That's why Bulgan left in such a hurry. However, his militia is no match for Scrutter's regular army. I respect the militia, but it's a fact that everyone's roles and training commitments are different. Old Ford's last sentence was addressed to Zane and the other militiamen. Chapter 558 Reclaiming the Lord's Mansion. Undoubtedly, the words of Steward Ford and Chief Inspector Hayden threw the police and militia into chaos. Everyone stared blankly at each other, unsure how to react, seemingly hoping their comrades would offer advice. Billiller McReynolds, held captive by Ruth Hayden, was ashen-faced. His earlier intimidation was a last-ditch effort, a desperate attempt to escape death, but instead of intimidating those present, he had received even worse news from Old Ford. Paul Gleman was still alive. Billiller McReynolds was now completely devastated. A question kept swirling in his mind: how had the people at the Lord's Manor obtained this information? Old Ford and the officials of the Council of State watched the police and militia with tense expressions. While the Lord's Manor guards were elite, there were only 30 of them, and they were not adequately prepared for conflict. Facing the numerically superior police and militia, no one dared to predict the outcome once the fight broke out. The group remained in a tense standoff. Just then, a decisive voice broke the deadlock. I believe Steward Ford, Lucas, from the police force, loudly declared his judgment. I've long suspected Captain McReynolds is acting strangely. Brothers, he stepped out of the ranks, standing before all the policemen, and addressed them directly. What are you all hesitating for? Steward Philip, and Lord Ford, you, as residents of Lackaherd, surely know their character. They've served 3 generations of Earl Griles. If their words are untrustworthy, who else can be trusted? Lord Schroeder's army is definitely outside the city. Besides, he glanced at the police captain, who had fallen into utter despair. Bill McReynolds has just confessed that he and Bulgan participated in the rebellion against Earl Gleman. As police officers loyal to Earl Gleman, how can we side with traitors? Yes, someone immediately responded. We absolutely cannot stand with traitors. Lucas was somewhat surprised. It wasn't his colleague who responded, but the militia captain, whose name seemed to be Zane. Zane also stepped forward and saluted Chief Steward Ford. Sir Steward, please give us your orders. Just tell us what you need us to do. But before Chief Steward Ford could speak, he raised his hand, turned, and shouted to the militia of Tata Village, Long live Gleman! Long live Arda! Long live Gleman! Long live Arda! The militia of Tata Village echoed Zane, all having made their choice. Yes, Bulgan is absolutely unpopular, perhaps influenced by the malicious spirit. The police also made their choice. I pledge my allegiance to Earl Paul Gleman. I have always been loyal to Earl Paul Gleman, all because of McReynolds' deception. Now, everyone in the hall had distanced themselves from the traitor. Good. Old Ford and the others, seeing that things were developing in the direction they had hoped for, finally breathed a sigh of relief. The Chief Steward of the Council ordered, now you will all be under the unified command of Chief Steward Hayden to ensure the defense of this castle. And make a big show of it. Let that traitor Bulgan know that something has happened in the castle, to disrupt their morale. Following Chief Steward Ford's orders, everyone immediately sprang into action. All the combat personnel, guards, militia, police, more than 200 people, were divided into several groups by Chief Steward Hayden and assigned to specific defensive areas. The castle gates, which had already been closed, were now filled with a pile of stuffing, boxes, furniture, sandbags, etc., with Hansel, Bernard, Cecil, and others participating in the moving. Then, a cannon mounted on the castle gate was fired. The booming cannon fire carried a message into the distance. At the border between Lakemore and Emden, 2 armies faced off. The larger force, numbering nearly 1,000, consisted mostly of soldiers, aside from a few knights on tall horses in full armor, wearing various colored and styled clothing, mostly made of linen. Their weapons, besides the knights, were a motley crew, lances, swords, even pitchforks. They stood in loose formation, waving their arms and making provocative gestures, spewing profanities. The smaller force, numbering less than 300, stood in neat rows, soldiers close together, holding loaded muskets with bayonets, silently and solemnly staring ahead. In stark contrast to the commotion on the other side, these soldiers remained silent, neither whispering nor exchanging murmurs. In stark contrast to the clamor of the opposing troops, two mounted men were conversing in the open space between the two vastly different armies. "This is outrageous," Earl Basil angrily questioned Lieutenant Colonel Walton. "I was invited by the town of Lancashire to suppress bandits, and you dared disregard your lord's orders and block my way, Earl Basil. Our own army can handle things here, we don't need outside help," Walton replied calmly. Besides, a hint of suspicion flashed in his eyes. "Are there really bandits? Or, you made them up, you dare?" Earl Basil shrieked. You dare doubt me." In the past, Basil wouldn't have bothered speaking to someone like Walton. A mere knight, how dare he sit face to face with a nobler like this? It was beneath him. "I am Earl Basil, a nobleman of the kingdom. How dare you, how dare you? This is an insult to me." "Listen up, Walton. Just a week ago, a gang of ruthless thugs attacked my territory, killing, burning, and looting. It took a tremendous amount of effort to find a lead. They're from Emden. Lakeside Town promised me an explanation and sent me personally to lead troops to find these bastards. I think you've received the order." Although he said this, Earl Basil's heart was pounding. What was going on? Wasn't it promised that I would be let in? Why was Walton so arrogant? Could something have gone wrong with what those people were doing? Chapter 559 Collapse. Lieutenant Bulgan, mounted on horseback, watched the approaching column from afar. Their steps were precise, their formation imposing, undoubtedly the regular army of Arda. Where did they come from? The garrison of Lancashire couldn't have returned so quickly. Could one of them have stayed behind? Bulgan's head throbbed with worry. Initially, Bulgan had been quite confident in the forces he commanded. After all, it was nearly 2,000 militiamen with basic military training. But as the army drew closer, his confidence began to waver. Every soldier was armed, and behind the column were at least 10 cannons. This made the situation rather grim. The Lancashire garrison had taken all its active duty artillery with them when they set out. What remained in the armory were obsolete pieces, several of them antiques from the pirate campaigns. The reason they weren't melted down was, it was said, that Paul Gleman intended to sell them to others at the appropriate time. When Count Gleman first conceived of the cannon as a weapon of mass destruction, cannon casting technology was still in its exploratory stage. Both the inventor, Count Gleman, and the craftsmen who brought it to life were driven by the belief that "I think it will work, so it should be done this way." From today's perspective, the cannons produced at that time were of questionable quality, although they did play a significant role in the early military operations of the Arda army. Another problem was that after being decommissioned, these cannons were stored in armories, lacking maintenance. Who knows if they would explode when pulled out and fired? Such an explosion would severely impact morale, especially for a group of poorly trained militia. It could affect their trust in the newly acquired firearms. Furthermore, firing cannons cannot be taught in a day or two, especially since Bulgan's training department only handled routine training. Artillery training had its own system. For all these reasons, Bulgan did not allow the militia to handle the cannons. The approaching army halted. Beside the column, among a group of mounted officers, Bulgan recognized a figure, Chief of Staff Scrutter. Not only Bulgan recognized him, but some militia members also recognized Scrutter. The old knight's appearance caused a slight commotion within the ranks. What was going on? Why was the army's chief of staff standing opposite them? Many wondered. Suddenly, Bulgan shouted, "Everyone! Raise your guns!" A clattering sound followed. Those who didn't recognize Scrutter raised their loaded muskets, while those who did followed suit. An officer beside Scrutter slowly advanced to within about 200 meters of the militia, then stopped. Bulgan cursed under his breath. The man held a tin megaphone to his mouth and shouted, "Militia brothers! You have all been deceived by Bulgan and his gang. In fact, he is the biggest rebel lurking in Lancashire town. While the Lord was away hunting, Bulgan used his position to issue false orders, attempting to use the militia to control the central government. Moreover, his accomplices launched an attack on the Lord in Barber, but his accomplices in Barber have been wiped out by the Lord's valiant guards. Only Bulgan and a few of his confidants are left to struggle desperately in Lancashire town. He even tried to drag you down with him. He is utterly evil. You must see through this shameless traitor and turn against him as soon as possible." "What's going on?" Bulgan was extremely shocked. How did the other side know about Barber Village? He immediately made the worst judgment. If his side had succeeded in Barber Village, Schroeder wouldn't have known about it so quickly, because the signal tower there had already been taken over. But if it were another scenario, that Paul Gleman had won and regained control of the signal tower, it might be possible to immediately send a message to those loyal to him. Then, what that man said, that the Lord eliminated the attackers, was it true or false? If the Lord sent the message out, then it must be true? Bulgan's mind was in turmoil. In fact, Bulgan was right. After Paul recaptured the nearest signal tower, he immediately tried to contact garrisons in various locations, and luckily, he made contact with Area 51. In any case, now it was a matter of life and death. Bulgan immediately countered, roaring at the top of his lungs, "Brothers, don't listen to the rebels' nonsense. I know you're wondering why the Chief of Staff is facing them, seeing Scrutter on the other side. But I regret to inform you that, as some of you astute individuals have already guessed, Scrutter is no longer the respected Chief of Staff. He has been seduced by the rebels and has sided with them. Look, he brought an entire army. As everyone knows, the 4 infantry battalions of Lakeside Town have already gone out for a field training, and the nearby militia have all gathered in Lakeside Town, that is, you. So what are we facing if not rebels? Now, I order you, in the name of the highest military commander of Lakeside Town, to resolutely, thoroughly, and mercilessly annihilate the enemy." The militia, unsure who was right, habitually obeyed orders, raising their guns. Just then, a thunderous sound came from behind them, from the direction of Lakeside Town. Bulgan was startled again. A very ominous premonition immediately gripped his heart. Had something happened in Lakeside Town? Otherwise, why would they fire cannons for no reason? And where would they find cannons in Lakeside Town? Aside from the old cannons lying ashes in the armory, he immediately thought of one place, the cannons mounted on the gate tower of the Lord's castle. Only one word could describe Bulgan's mood at this moment, utterly icy. "All troops, listen up." He seemed to have lost his mind. "Advance." The militiamen looked at each other, but obeyed Bulgan's order, lowering their rifles from their aiming points and marching towards the opposing army. Advance to the easiest spot to aim, fire. Then charge in for bayonet combat. This was the only thought in Bulgan's mind at that moment. The officer who had been sent out by Scrutter to shout the order shook his head helplessly, turned his horse around, and returned to his chief of staff. "No, Lord Scrutter, without direct evidence, the militia cannot extricate themselves from Bulgan's lies. Are we really going to open fire on them?" Scrutter shook his head and looked at the officer, saying, "I remember a new type of firearm that is very accurate. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels." Chapter 560 Collapse 2. The militiamen continued advancing, their faces showing hesitation and doubt, but their steps remained neat and firm. Resolute execution of orders was a crucial part of their military training. On Schroeder's side, 20 Arda soldiers, armed with the new firearms, stepped forward and took the lead. "Aim!" At the chief of staff's command, the 20 soldiers raised their weapons. If one were to look closely at the muzzle, they would see spiral patterns inside the barrels. To Bulgan, the situation was strange. Shouldn't all the ranks immediately raise their weapons to engage the enemy? Why were only 20 men prepared? Then he immediately noticed something even more bizarre. The flintlock muskets commonly used now, due to their low accuracy, were often fired in volleys. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder in a tight line, pointing their weapons directly forward, and fired simultaneously upon receiving the command. While the accuracy of individual shots was low, the overall hit rate was quite good. Even if a bullet's trajectory is wildly erratic, it won't necessarily make a 90-degree turn, giving it a high probability of hitting some unlucky soldier in the opposing formation. After all, the enemy is also arranged in a line or square formation, and collective fire would cause even greater casualties. Therefore, when firing at a distance from the enemy, soldiers are not required to deliberately aim at a specific target. However, in Bulgan's eyes now, the 20 soldiers in front of Scrutter's column, their guns, were all pointed at him. What was going on? Were they going to kill him, their commander, first? Could they even hit him? An ominous premonition enveloped Bulgan, making every hair on his body stand on end. But what could he do now? Hide behind his men in full view of everyone? What a joke. Bulgan gritted his teeth, maintaining his upright posture, and continued to advance alongside the militia in their line. "Haha, Lieutenant Colonel Claude, commander of the 9th Infantry Battalion, grinned and said happily to Chief of Staff Schroeder, "He's courting death." Seeing Bulgan enter effective firing range, the old knight roared, "Fire!" At his command, 20 rifled flintlock muskets opened fire simultaneously, bullets spinning and hurtling towards their targets. As the head of the training department, Bulgan frequently handled guns, teaching soldiers how to shoot, supervising their training, and honing his own marksmanship. Every time he touched the cold barrel of a gun and the bullets, he marveled at this marvelous creation of Paul Gleman, ruthless, powerful, unstoppable, and lethal with a single strike, truly the perfect weapon to take lives. Swords and bows paled in comparison. Bulgan had also imagined more than once what it would feel like to be struck by such a terrifying weapon. Having seen the wounds of wounded enemies on the battlefield, he knew the sight was undeniably horrific. He had asked wounded soldiers about their experiences, but words could never replace first-hand experience. What would it be like to be hit by a musket? Now Bulgan knew. In a mere instant, at least 10 deformed lead bullets pierced his flesh, one even piercing his shoulder blade. Was it painful? Bulgan didn't know, because being struck in a vital spot so quickly, his brain perhaps didn't have time to register it. His only sensation was his life rapidly ebbing away. He felt as if an invisible, transparent barrier was gradually isolating him from everything outside. First, his sense of touch became dulled, but he could still see the terrified expressions of the militiamen and hear the panicked cries. Gradually, even their voices became blurred, until finally he could neither see nor hear, and the flame of his consciousness began to die out. Father, grandfather, would the ancestors of the family be proud of me? Alice, perhaps the Valen family would cease to exist. But, how did Earl Gremmen escape the attack? How did the Lord's men know about the outside world? Where did the Chief of Staff find his troops? The Lord's guards were indeed elite, but they couldn't withstand the sheer number of his own men. If necessary, he'd set fire to the forest. To cut off communication, he'd taken control of several key signal towers, imposed martial law to control the major roads of Lakehart Town, and finally, waited until the garrison in Lakehart Town was far away before making his move. Every carefully considered and prepared measure had gone awry. With these mysteries lingering, Bulgan's life ended. Bulgan Varin, the current commander of the militia, was dead. This army, which he had organized just 2 days prior, had lost its last line of defense. The doubts that plagued their minds, the anxiety of potentially being a traitor, the fear of facing a regular army, especially those cannons gleaming with a chilling light, finally broke their spirits. A clattering sound rang out, the sound of guns being thrown to the ground. The militiamen hung their heads, shoulders slumped, awaiting their fate. Would they be executed by cannon fire? There were cannons readily available on the other side, a thought that filled many with despair. Accompanying Bulgan were several of his close associates, but their authority was insufficient to reorganize the army. In fact, their own will had already crumbled. The cannon fire from the Lord's manor had already signaled that they had no way out, so they simply raised their hands high. Schroeder flicked the reins, rode his horse closer, and grabbed the megaphone, shouting, "All militiamen, listen up. Battalion Commander Claude will take you back to the camp in Lakeside Town. You will stay there for now and are not allowed to leave." He emphasized the last part, "not allowed to leave. You'll be spoken to one by one later. If you were merely misled by traitors during the rebellion and didn't actively commit any evil deeds, the Lord will treat you leniently. But if anyone colluded with traitors or took advantage of the chaos to commit evil, and the evidence is conclusive, then they will absolutely not be let off." Most of the militiamen felt as if they had been granted a pardon after hearing the Chief of Staff's words, looking like they had escaped a calamity. A few, however, remained uneasy, sweating profusely. Bulgan's trusted men were bound hand and foot and given a good beating. Battalion Commander Claude pointed towards the town in the middle of the lake and said to Schroeder, "Sir, someone's coming from the town." Schroeder looked and indeed saw 2 knights galloping towards them, raising a long cloud of dust behind them. They seemed to be the Imperial Guard. Claude, with his excellent eyesight, recognized the newcomer's clothing. Chapter 561 Coming. The Internal Guard's role in the Arda military and political system is similar to the armed police in Paul's previous life. Currently maintained at a size of 100, the Internal Guard handles situations that ordinary police cannot manage. They are also responsible for the security of various confidential departments of the State Council. Equipped with flintlock muskets and light artillery, the Internal Guard is better suited to dealing with extreme violence than the police, who are usually only equipped with melee weapons. When Bulgan launched his rebellion, the State Council, misled by him, handed over command of the Internal Guard to him. This made the Internal Guard the most powerful force under Bulgan's control, far more well-trained than the militia. However, upon learning of Scrutter's army outside the city, Bulgan lacked the courage to lead such an armed force into battle. He feared the Internal Guard was too familiar with Scrutter and would likely defect on the battlefield. Therefore, he only led the militia out of the city to confront Scrutter, while the Internal Guard was divided into several small squads and deployed in different areas of the city. However, a cannon shot from the Lord's Manor caught the attention of the Imperial Guard. The squad closest to the manor immediately sent men to the castle to investigate, and naturally, they quickly learned the truth about the rebellion. They then contacted the other squads, who assembled in front of the manor. Meanwhile, those inside the manor learned that Lakeside Town was now practically deserted, with most of the militia taken outside by Bulgan. They seized this opportunity and collectively signed an order, which the Imperial Guard proclaimed throughout the town. Without Bulgan as their leader, his remaining associates in the town lost their backbone. Under the pressure of Scrutter outside and the Council of State inside, they were quickly arrested, and Lakeside Town returned to the control of the Loyalists. The Imperial Guard immediately sent men out of the town to gather the latest information, only to discover that the instigator of the rebellion, Bulgan, had already been killed. They then went to Scrutter. After reading the letter personally written by Old Ford, Chief of Staff Scrutter and Battalion Commander Claude of the 9th Infantry Battalion did not hesitate and immediately led their troops into Lakeshire. The two quickly arrived at the Lord's mansion. "Oh, Father. Thank goodness you are all right," Scrutter saw Ron, the Minister of Logistics, and Kelly, the Minister of Equipment, and immediately went forward to embrace them. "Lord Scrutter, we thought we would never see you again." Ron and Kelly were in tears. After Scrutter realized something was wrong and left Lakeshire, the two became the biggest obstacle to Bulgan's usurpation of leadership of the armed forces, so they were immediately attacked and imprisoned. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, the key figures from both the military and political sides sat down to discuss the next steps. Scrutter brought back good news to everyone. Count Gleman had defeated the attackers and was alive and well, which completely relieved Chief Steward Ford and Butler Philip. After discussion, everyone agreed that the most urgent task was to bring the Lord back to Lakeshire and ensure his absolute safety, while also bringing Earl Garner to Lakeshire. Furthermore, Lakeshire would remain under martial law until the aftermath of the rebellion had completely subsided. Also, after recapturing the signal tower near Lakeshire, the Lord's Manor received information from Emden that the 6th Infantry Battalion had repelled Earl Basil's army attempting to enter Emden at the border. Scrutter, on behalf of the General Staff, wrote back to Lieutenant Colonel Walton, commander of the 6th Infantry Battalion, explaining the situation, praising his choice, and ordering him to continue guarding the surrounding major powers. 2 days later, Paul and Mellon returned to Lakeshire one after the other. "Gentlemen," Paul gathered his men at the Lord's Manor, his voice choked with emotion. "I have never felt so close to you all before. His shoulders trembled slightly. "Lord Gleman, please don't be so agitated." Bernard, the Lord's Secretary, comforted him. "Those gathered here are your closest friends and loyal subordinates. They would never harm you." "I know, Bernard, thank you." Paul took a few slow breaths to calm himself. However, the Lord's brow immediately furrowed, and everyone present could see a resentment swirling across his face. "I will punish them severely. I will punish them severely." The Lord muttered these words repeatedly, but everyone heard them clearly. It seemed Earl Gleman was about to announce the punishment for the rebels. He abruptly stood up, raising his voice. "Looking back now, I realize how much I procrastinated. Since such slow, gradual reforms could incite their rebellion, I should have just unleashed a storm. You watch, I won't hold back anymore. All my plans will be put into practice, all reforms will begin immediately. Petitions, public opinion, bullshit. I'll never care about that stuff again." "What?" The crowd exchanged bewildered glances. "Plans? Reforms?" Earl Gleman wasn't thinking about how to deal with the rebels, but rather about his own policies. It was truly baffling. "Thomas," Paul shouted to the chief judge of the Lord's Court. "Yes, Lord Gleman." The chief judge, who had never seen Paul act this way before, immediately stood up. "Immediately expand the scale of the Lord's Court. Every town should have a court station there, ensuring its reach extends to every surrounding village, even the most remote ones." "Understood, sir," Thomas replied hastily. The reason for this, Paul explained, I intend to centralize all judicial power with the Lord's court. From now on, no one may establish private punishments or prisons. No one except judges of the Lord's court has the right to try anyone else. In contrast, the expansion of law enforcement power, Ruth, Paul called upon the head of the Public Security Department. Yes, sir, Ruth Hayden replied, looking at his lord. I order you to expand the police force. In addition to the major cities, agencies should be established in villages and towns, their jurisdiction effectively extending to every surrounding village. As you command, Lord Griles, Ruth Hayden responded. Wackley, Paul looked at Old Ford, the Grand Steward of the Council. We must strengthen our management at the grassroots level. The old approach of simply sending an administrative officer to the village is absolutely no longer viable. This is Chapter 557, the title is incorrect. Chapter 562 Punishment. The new village management body, I've decided to call it the Village Management Committee, not the old farm community, must manage every aspect of the village, including household registration, public affairs, disaster preparedness, and even weddings, funerals, and mediation of neighborhood disputes. All of these things fall under the responsibility of the village committee. Of course, this can't be done by one person alone, so a committee needs to be formed, Paul explained, outlining his grassroots governance policy. Moreover, it will represent me, an extension of my mouth, eyes, and ears, able to quickly, resolutely, and powerfully convey the spirit and will of Lakeside Town, while also rapidly and truthfully reporting all the village's affairs back to Lakeside Town. It must be said that this is a highly idealistic statement, even somewhat absurd. Paul's vision is impossible to realize in the 21st century, let alone in this world that hasn't fully emerged from the Middle Ages. It's a pipe dream. But striving in this direction is never wrong, one has to take the first step. As Paul just said, the functions of the village committee cannot be handled by one or two administrators. Old Ford frowned deeply upon hearing this. Lord Gleman, this will definitely increase our administrative costs significantly, then expand our administrative staff, finance. If that doesn't work, issue bonds, Paul exclaimed. Anyway, our fiscal revenue has been growing. And I believe that after this reform, our economy will be more vibrant and healthier. By unleashing the productivity and consumption power of the countryside, Paul continued eloquently, to tell you the truth, in my opinion, our countryside is extremely abnormal. Yes, we haven't had legal slavery for almost 1,000 years, but various unreasonable rules and regulations have allowed the de facto system of slavery to continue. I think everyone is well aware of this. Those powerful families in those villages, most notably the Warrens in this rebellion, and that Fergus fellow, possess vast tracts of land, their wealth accumulated and passed down through generations. They also hold the power to collect taxes for generations, imposing punishments at their own discretion in deciding all matters, big and small, in the village. Aren't they the de facto lords of their villages? And I, the true lord, can only convey my orders and collect taxes through them, and the farmers' wishes can only reach me through them. It seems my orders can only travel freely within a few cities. This is simply outrageous. Paul was filled with resentment as he spoke of this. In the Northwest Bay, the rural landowners used various tangible and intangible privileges to turn the vast peasantry into their de facto slaves. For example, they would rent their land to poor, landless farmers, charging exorbitant rents, leaving the farmers with only a meager amount of food to eat, rendering them unable to expand their businesses, depriving them of the opportunity to accumulate wealth, and forcing them to eke out a living by cultivating their rented land. Take, for example, usury. Combined with their former status as tax farmers, this tactic was incredibly effective. Every time taxes were collected, farmers who couldn't pay were forced to default, and the interest snowballed, causing debts to grow exponentially. Some farming families were even in debt for generations, with no end in sight. The landowners would then exploit their creditor status to extort whatever little property the debtors had, sometimes even targeting the debtors' wives and daughters. It wasn't just during tax collection that farmers were burdened with debt. Poor harvests or natural disasters also created frequent borrowing opportunities in rural areas, where ordinary farmers had very low risk tolerance. Want to avoid repayment? Want to escape debt? Sorry, in the village, the landlord's word was law. In short, the landlords used various methods to force farmers to depend on them, binding them firmly to their land. Paul's vigorous promotion of agricultural techniques in previous years, while greatly increasing arable land and yields, saw the vast majority of the increase going into the pockets of rural landowners. The only apparent benefit for ordinary farmers seemed to be the reduction in mass starvation. Paul's deployment of officials to the countryside, the establishment of agricultural societies, the creation of circuit courts to adjudicate cases for farmers, and the prohibition of private executions brought some improvement, but no fundamental change. While the numerous factories Paul established provided farmers who had left the countryside with a second way to support themselves, the forces of tradition remained strong, and many farmers remained bound by tradition. "Look," Paul said angrily, spreading his hands to one of his subordinates, "this time, I only wanted to reclaim a small amount of power from them, taxation and the judiciary, and they're like vicious dogs guarding their food, baring their sharp fangs and lunging at me, so I've decided." He clenched his fist tightly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Since they are so oblivious to the times, then I will completely strip them of all their privileges. Note, all privileges, except for abolishing the tax farming system and reclaiming judicial power. I will go even further, yes, I will go even further. First, I will reduce interest and rent. I will set a maximum rate for the rent collected from tenant farmers. In short, it must not be so high that it only leaves farmers with enough food for sustenance. It must leave them with seeds to cultivate next year, and enough grain to trade in the market. Farmers must be able to sell their grain and use the money to buy other goods they want, to truly improve their lives through farming, not just to survive. Then there is private lending. I will set reasonable interest rates so that hard-working people cannot repay their debts. For those existing old debts, I will send people to review them one by one. Those that are unclear or have outrageous interest rates will be burned to ashes. For those who really cannot repay their debts, their descendants only need to publicly declare that they renounce their inheritance rights, and then they will not have to inherit the debts, preventing the debt from being passed down from generation to generation. Then, I will also establish an agricultural bank. Agricultural bank? This term piqued the interest of everyone present. The agricultural bank lends to farmers at extremely low interest rates, Paul explained. If farmers encounter misfortunes such as natural disasters or poor harvests, they can borrow from the agricultural bank, not from those blood-sucking private lenders. Historically, the rural conditions in the Middle Ages were incredibly diverse and impossible to define definitively. The rural society of the Northwest Bay described in the book is a fabricated version of several typical feudal social characteristics selected by the author. Chapter 563 Punishment 2. Paul's words stirred a ripple in the hearts of those present. If the Lord's policies were fully implemented and effective, the gentry and landowners who had controlled the villages for generations would essentially become a group of ordinary people with a bit of money, placing them on the same level as the peasants they had never looked down upon. Hansel Abbott, the head of the Ministry of Agriculture, suddenly felt immense pressure. Paul's measures would have a near-revolutionary impact on rural areas, potentially causing a huge disruption to agricultural production under his jurisdiction. However, Hansel couldn't be sure whether the impact would be beneficial or harmful. Ordinary farmers would be happy and might work harder in their fields, but the landowners with vast tracts of land would certainly be unhappy. What if they secretly sabotaged things? Yes, Paul's description sounded wonderful, but history is full of examples of good intentions ending in tragedy. After all, even the worst order was still an order. Earl Gleman's bombshell would undoubtedly destroy the old order, but whether a new order would form or continue in chaos was too uncertain. Lord Gleman, Hansel raised his hand, indicating he had something to say. Do you have anything to add? Clearly, Count Gleman didn't want to hear any dissenting opinions. Hansel cautiously offered his suggestion. Such a drastic reform, shouldn't we first select 1 or 2 villages for a trial? What if the reform has any impact on agricultural production, potentially affecting people's livelihoods? Oh, no. Hansel, Paul waved his hand without hesitation. While the reforms are indeed drastic, they are all legal and debt-related, they don't involve any changes to the production structure. I can't imagine what negative impact it would have on production if everyone obeyed the law. If there's any impact, then someone must be sabotaging things behind the scenes. Paul frowned, his expression turning serious, and he scanned everyone present with a scrutinizing gaze. Finally, he stared at Hansel and said, if we do as you say, and select 1 or 2 places for pilot testing first, wouldn't that just give our potential enemies time to react? I can already imagine them doing everything in their power to sabotage those places used for testing the reforms, and then loudly proclaiming that the Lord's reforms are nothing but a farce. The Lord's words carried an undeniable tone. Therefore, we must surprise them with a swift and decisive attack, leaving them absolutely no time to think or react. Lord Griles is right, Cecil expressed his support for Paul. We should look on the bright side. Those stingy landlords, though they possess vast wealth, are few in number. Even if they squander it all, how much manufactured goods can they consume? The luxury goods they buy with their vast sums don't significantly stimulate manufacturing. But if we follow Lord Gleman's idea and give the vast majority of farmers, who now make up the majority of our population, money in their hands, and if they can enter the market to consume, the stimulus to manufacturing will be enormous. For example, salt, cloth, clothing, shoes, and hats, and various metal products. These are all products that ordinary families would definitely need. It's not that the farmers didn't want to buy things, they just didn't have the money. Paul nodded. As I said at the beginning, if everything goes smoothly, then the increased tax revenue from industry and commerce should be able to make up for the initial administrative investment. The Lord's mind was made up, and no one voiced any objection. Lord Gleman, we have drafted a basic strategy for dealing with those involved in this rebellion. Chief Judge Thomas tried to steer the meeting back to the topic everyone had initially hoped for. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to Paul. Paul took it, unfolded it, and quickly glanced at it. Under everyone's gaze, the change in Paul's expression was somewhat puzzling. Just moments before, the Lord had been aggressive, speaking through gritted teeth, giving the impression that he wanted nothing more than to slice the landowners into pieces and devour them raw with soy sauce. However, after reading the paper the chief judge had handed him, the Lord's face suddenly calmed down. He seemed to ponder for a second or two before the count spoke. The punishment of those who plot rebellion is certainly necessary, and your suggestions are reasonable. However, I believe the most urgent task is to interrogate them, to pry open the mouths of those surviving bastards, and before chopping off their heads, try to extract as much information as possible, such as whether there are any accomplices who have not been exposed, whether they are still in contact with certain external forces, and so on. In addition, we must also identify who the masterminds are, who the accomplices are, and whether there are any people who knew about this conspiracy but concealed it. Hearing the Lord's words, everyone's hearts, which had been somewhat on edge, relaxed, and their furrowed brows eased. Why were they on edge? Because considering the Lord's usual personality, everyone was afraid that after reading the contents of the paper, he would blurt out, "Ah, this is too cruel," but now it seemed that the Count did not object to the contents. At least not now. "You're right, Lord Griles," said Ruth Hayden, head of the Public Security Department. "Regarding the contents of this paper, we just want you to set the basic tone for the final trial." Paul asked him, "Then how long do you think it would take to get to the bottom of all the aspects of this rebellion, such as what I just mentioned?" Ruth replied, "This rebellion involves a vast number of people, and their identities are very complex. Within our ranks alone, there are the army, militia, police, and possibly telegraph station personnel. Externally, there are the powerful local families led by Fergus and Warren, along with their servants and the villagers they've coerced. In Cecil's and my opinion, the interrogation could take 1.5 to 2 years, that long." Paul scratched his chin. Finally, he said, "Very well, if you encounter any difficulties, just let me know." "Yes, Lord Griles." "Also, what," Steward Ford said, "until everything is settled, shall we suspend accepting new recruits from Barber Village and several other villages around it, and prohibit those people from participating in the civil service examinations of the State Council?" "That's a very prudent approach." Paul completely agreed with the suggestion. Chapter 564 Punishment 3. After the meeting with his subordinates, Paul told his butler, Philip, that he wanted to be alone for a while, and silently walked towards his office. Entering the room he had once thought he would never return to, Paul stretched languidly. Night was beginning to fall, with the last rays of the sun still lingering on the horizon. The office was dimly lit, without candles. Using the sliver of light streaming through the window, he made out the furnishings, just as he had left them. Everything was so familiar. He was finally back. Paul quietly walked to his desk, where a stack of documents lay, office papers he remembered he hadn't finished processing. He went around to the back of the desk and placed his hand on the ergonomic chair he had designed, feeling its warm, familiar touch. "Oh, old friend," Paul said to his chair, "I thought I'd never see you again." He plopped down, leaning back, putting his feet on the desk in front of him, letting out a long sigh, and then staring blankly at the dark ceiling. Just then, Paul suddenly felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him from all directions, making him desperately want to sleep. However, the sleepiness vanished the moment he closed his eyes. He remained in this state for an unknown amount of time until a knock on the door interrupted his reverie. "Come in." With a creak, the head of the butler, Philip, peeked in from outside. "You startled me, Lord Gleman. Why didn't you light a lamp?" The old butler entered the office and skillfully lit the candles on the candlestick, instantly illuminating the room. "Philip, what is it?" Paul had just told the butler he wanted to be alone for a while, so Philip must have something to say. "Lord Gleman, Sir Abbot is back. He wants to discuss some matters with you in person." Hansel, Paul was somewhat surprised. What could he possibly want with him? Could they have discussed it at the meeting earlier? Why did he need to speak with him privately? Paul told Philip, "Let him in. I'll wait for him here." "Yes, Lord Gleman." The old butler bowed slightly and withdrew. Less than 2 minutes later, footsteps sounded in the corridor, followed by another knock on the door. "Please come in, Hansel." The door opened, revealing the face of the head of the Ministry of Agriculture. "Excuse me, Lord Gleman." He entered the room and gently closed the door behind him. Paul continued to recline in his chair, only lazily tilting his head towards the sofa next to him, where Hansel plopped down. Paul asked him, "What do you want to talk to me about so late?" Actually, I'm not here on my own behalf, but on behalf of everyone." A look of confusion appeared on Paul's face. Only then did he suddenly realize that Hansel's expression was incredibly serious. This man usually had the air of a carefree playboy, and this expression was extremely rare. Paul asked curiously, "The people you're referring to are old Ford, Cecil, Victor, and others? Did they send you?" Hansel then forced a smile. "Lord Gleman, please don't misunderstand. Actually, no one assigned me this task. It's just that I can guess some of their thoughts, which also resonate with some of my own, so I felt it necessary to represent them. As for those so-called thoughts, perhaps it would be awkward for those close to you to say them to your face, but Paul pointed to him, a stranger from Crystal Radiance, and also a representative of the royal family. Hansel nodded. "Yes. Perhaps it's more appropriate for someone as distant as me to discuss this with you." "Interesting." A smile appeared on Paul's face. He stood up from his chair, walked around the desk, and went to a small table in the corner. He picked up the wine on the table, poured 2 glasses, one in each hand, and handed the one in his left hand to Hansel. The 2 clinked glasses lightly and each took a sip. Paul said, "I never imagined that these vassals, who have been loyal to the Gleman family for generations, would have things they couldn't say directly to my face." "In that case, Hansel, you speak for them, Lord Gleman." Hansel regained his serious expression and went straight to the point. "During the meeting just now, regarding the note Judge Thomas handed you, the one about how to deal with traitors, you seemed to have some doubts about its contents." Well, Paul didn't know how to answer. The note the chief judge handed him was simple: for everyone involved in the rebellion, their entire family would be exterminated. Unless otherwise specified, this punishment meant the complete annihilation of the entire family, regardless of gender, age, or even close servants, eliminating all traces. After reading it, Paul neither directly agreed nor disagreed, wanting to appear decisive in the face of rebellion. But that momentary hesitation was noticed by those with ulterior motives. "Hansel," Paul said with some helplessness, "I hate that class, not specific individuals. This indiscriminate, one-size-fits-all approach feels a bit too much, even if this time it endangered your life." "Hansel, don't get confused. I'll definitely deal with the bastards who threatened my life, but their families, women, children, the elderly, may never have known anything from beginning to end, and they were implicated, thrown into prison, or even lose their lives." This, Paul shook his head. "Lord Gleman," Hansel said seriously, "you're having such thoughts shows you're a kind person, which is good. But what if the traitor's descendants grow up, and, assuming they've amassed considerable power through their scheming, seek revenge against you? Have you considered that?" Paul replied, "Of course I've considered that, but with strict precautions, it seems impossible. Think about it, how much power can the descendants of a ruined family have to cause me trouble? Lord Gleman, you need to consider the worst-case scenario. You can't just naively expect the other side to act according to your wishes." Paul replied quietly, "If after doing everything that should be done, I'm still, well, that's just fate." Clap, clap, clap. Hansel applauded Paul, but his expression grew increasingly sarcastic. "Sometimes, The protagonist in this book is also the subject of the author's criticism. Haha. Chapter 565 Punishment 4. Hansel's applause seemed to praise Paul, but the expression on his face made him very uncomfortable. What? Is there something wrong with what I said, Lord Gleman? Hansel looked at Paul, adopting a sincere expression. I know there are always some people in this world with a strong sense of morality. Paul narrowed his eyes, looking at Hansel with obvious displeasure, and said in an unfriendly tone, "Are you being sarcastic?" Hansel stared into Paul's eyes. "If you think I've offended you, you can send someone to cut off my head. You have that right." Paul rolled his eyes at him and said nothing more. Hansel continued, "I know that satisfying one's moral sense is indeed a pleasant thing, and sometimes I give alms to beggars on the street. Whenever I do this, I feel my soul is elevated." He then changed the subject. "However, my giving alms to beggars only benefits the beggar and myself. It doesn't harm a third person." Paul understood his implication. "What do you mean? You mean that being soft-hearted will hurt others?" "Yes, Earl Gleman." Hansel no longer concealed his intentions and went straight to the point. "If you are merely a person, forgiving your enemies is good. It's a magnanimous and commendable act." But Hansel stood up from the sofa and slowly walked to the window behind Paul, fully opening the curtains that had been half-drawn. Night had completely fallen, and the sparsely starlit sky covered the city. Every household had lit its own lights. Paul's office window faced the central avenue of Lake Town, running from north to south. From here, the radiance of the lights was spectacular. "But you are not alone now, Earl Paul Gleman. Look at this town, you are its master. This means a large group of people are loyal to you and serve you. In other words, you are now a leader. Think of Sir Ford, Cecil, Schroeder, Victor, Bryce, and Butler Philip, and so on and so forth. Many of them have been loyal to your family for generations, their relationship with you being one of mutual support and shared destiny. Does not your excellency consider these loyal subjects? You may disregard your own safety, but can you bear to put them in danger as well? If you insist, and I mean if, after all, you have always appeared too merciful, on not eliminating potential enemies, isn't that selfish, trading the safety of your subordinates for your own false sense of moral superiority?" Paul was flustered, wanting to say something but unable to utter a word. After an awkward silence of half a minute, he finally said, "It's simply ridiculous. A bunch of relatives of criminals, imagine, almost all old, weak, women, and children. What threat could they pose? Would the bigwigs of Lacquer Town be intimidated by these people?" "Oh, you can't think like that, Lord Griles. They might not be able to rebel in broad daylight, but what about assassinations in the shadows? The appearance of the old, weak, women, and children might be more deceptive, and who knows what their children might do when they grow up? You know, assassins are crucial figures in changing the course of history. So many illustrious figures have fallen at their hands. You and your subjects, even your families, will be in danger. Yes, your moral standards are high, but you cannot expect your enemies to be on the same level. Our prevailing value system is this: avenging one's loved ones is a commendable act." Paul slumped back into his chair, deeply stung by Hansel's words of comfort, a sentiment echoed by his own subordinate. Yes, he could disregard his own fate, but he couldn't ignore those loyal to him. Should he truly eliminate all potential dangers before they even began? He thought for a moment, then finally said, "Hansel, you can call me selfish, but history should move forward, not circle around in circles. Someone has to take the first step forward, regardless of their motivation, whether it's from the heart or driven by vanity." "They still chose to move forward," Hansel said with some emotion. "Lord Gleman, the road of history is full of thorns, and those who go first are often pricked and bleeding." "Yes, I know, it's not fun at all," Paul said helplessly, shrugging his shoulders, "but I'm prepared." The conversation with Hansel made him feel even more tired, and he decided to end the discussion. "Hansel, there's still more than a year until the final trial. During this time, I will consider things carefully and try to make the outcome take all aspects into account. Now, I'm a little tired." Hansel sighed softly, walked slowly to face Paul, and then bowed slightly. "Since I met you, I have witnessed many things I never dared to imagine before. Perhaps your convictions are correct. Whatever choice you ultimately make, I believe in your wisdom, Lord Gleman." "Thank you, Hansel." In the few days since Paul returned to the Lord's Manor, news of the unusual events in Lakeside Town has spread far and wide. So many residents have witnessed everything that happened in the city from beginning to end: the large-scale martial law, the constant mobilization of militia, the cannon fire from the Lord's manor, the standoff between the troops outside the city, it was impossible to hide it. However, the attack on Paul and Barber village, because of its remote location, was less known. The rumors grew increasingly outrageous. In places far from Arda, some even claimed that the current Earl Gleman was no longer the original Earl Gleman, but merely a puppet resembling Paul Gleman sitting in the Lord's seat. Two groups were most concerned about this news. First, the vassal lords of Emden, for whom figuring out who was now in charge was of paramount importance. Then there were the other lords of the customs union, who sent envoys, or even traveled in person, to Lakeshire to confirm that Paul Gleman still held the position of lord. Many only then realized that Paul Gleman had risen to a prominent position in the Northwest Bay. Chapter 566 Determination. Hydra, the capital of the Duchy of Eaton, had been in a state of jubilation for several days. The streets were filled with people singing and dancing, taverns offered half-price fares and stayed open all night. Apart from the heavily armed guards on the city walls, everyone wore genuine smiles. This was because the duchy's ruler, Grand Duke Atia Cabre, had led his army to victory outside the city against the Church of Hornbay's apocryphal forces. This apocryphal army, led by General Fedidov of Collins, was a well-equipped force comprised of cavalry, infantry, archers, and auxiliary troops. They had borrowed a route from the unsuspecting neutral northern states, and upon arriving in Eaton's territory, the army was at the height of its power and morale. Their continuous victories filled everyone from the commander to the soldiers with unwavering confidence in victory. If Eaton were captured, and a combined attack were launched from the north against the main force of the Protestant Alliance, the vulnerable heartland of the Hornby Alliance, and simultaneously against the Anglican army, which was confronting the main force of the Hornby Alliance in the east, it would be like a giant iron clamp clamping an egg. With a little force, the egg would shatter, and the coastal nations would fall back into the control of the Hornby Church, while those blasphemous villains would be punished. However, this formidable army suffered a crushing defeat at the gates of Hydra. They met their match, suffering heavy losses, and were routed by the army of Prince Cabr. The Church's expeditionary force was utterly defeated and returned in disarray. Perhaps utterly defeated is an understatement, as they were completely routed, falling into a state of disorganization and indiscipline. It's hard to say how many of them actually made it back. According to eyewitnesses, the initial battlefield situation was quite unfavorable for the Eaton army, until a mysterious and powerful reinforcement entered the battlefield, turning the tide of the battle. Inside the palace of Hydra, Ediot Cabre, the ruler of Eaton, lay quietly on a recliner. His eyes were closed, and his right arm was stretched out on a small table beside him. A doctor was changing his bandages. Hiss, the Grand Duke couldn't help but groan. He had been wounded in the battle to defend Hydra, struck hard in the right arm by a large iron hammer, almost causing him to lose control of his arm on the spot. The greatsword he had been holding fell to the ground. The intense pain even made the Grand Duke feel faint, but fortunately, he was protected by his guards. Even more fortunately, the battlefield situation had now turned around, and the Eaton soldiers were launching a vigorous counterattack against the enemy. If it had been when the Eaton army was struggling to hold on, the Grand Duke's injury might have caused his army to collapse instantly. "Your Majesty, please bear with it, it will be over soon." "Oh, all right, you can move your arm a little, but don't move too fast or too much." Grand Duke Cabre lifted his bandaged arm from the table and slowly contracted and stretched it a few times. "I feel I'm recovering quickly, at least I feel better every day." "Your feeling is correct, Your Majesty," the doctor said easily. "I estimate that in about 10 days, your arm will be fully recovered. Thank you for your care, Ramirez." The Grand Duke thanked him. "Oh, I don't deserve your thanks, Your Majesty. Not to mention that as your court physician, it is my duty. To be able to care for the hero who saved Eaton is the greatest honor of my life. If anything were to happen to you, I would be devoured alive by the people of Hydra as soon as I stepped out of the kingdom's gates." Dr. Ramirez looked at Grand Duke Cabre with a face full of reverence. Grand Duke Cabre chuckled modestly. "Haha, I only did what I was supposed to do. The heroes who saved Eaton are others." The doctor waved his hand. "You mustn't belittle yourself." He assumed the Grand Duke was referring to the loyal soldiers. "My dear, how are you?" a sweet female voice called from outside. Grand Duchess Helen entered with light, graceful steps. "Oh, Helen, Ramirez treated me very well. He said I'll be fully recovered in about 10 days. You see," the Grand Duke spoke, leaping from his recliner and waving his arms as if to show off to his wife, causing Dr. Ramirez to quickly pull him back. "Your Majesty, you shouldn't be moving around too much right now." Helen quickened her pace to stand before her husband, her eyes wide with anger. "Have you forgotten the pain as soon as your wounds healed?" The Grand Duchess was gentle and rarely angry. When she was angry, it had a unique charm, and Grand Duke Cabre was instantly captivated. Dr. Ramirez felt he should leave, so he excused himself and quietly departed. The Grand Duke gently embraced his wife with his still functioning left arm. "Any new news from Professor Marianne?" Helen looked up at her husband, displeased. "What? Do I have to wait for news from the front before I can visit my husband?" "Ah, my dear, you know that's not what I meant." Grand Duke Cabre gave a wry smile. "Women, they always find fault with you unexpectedly. I'm just very concerned about the battle situation. After all, we finally gained the momentum for a counterattack." HMPH, Helen wrinkled her little nose slightly, giving me a let's let it go look. "Teacher Marianne did send me the latest news. A more detailed battle report written by your general should arrive the day after tomorrow." Hurry up and let me hear Teacher Marianne's report." "I can't wait," Helen said seriously. "What I can confirm is that our church army really has no ability to fight back." "Oh?" The remnants of the church army retreated in a rather disarray. Those neutral city-states that they borrowed from seized this opportunity and began to rebel. There are traps waiting ahead, and we are pursuing them from behind. They have suffered continuous losses along the way, and they can hardly be called an army anymore. Haha, this is truly gratifying." Didn't the doctor tell you to be careful?" In his excitement, Grand Duke Cabre couldn't help but start waving his arm again, and then a pain struck, which made his wife scold him again. "There's more good news. The city-state of Parada hopes to receive our protection in case the church's army returns." "Huh?" Cabre was surprised. This news was indeed an unexpected bonus. The Grand Duke, as the ruler of a nation, understood all too well what this meant, a proactive request for protection from Eden. However, Professor Marianne suggests that our army should stop at Parada. Going any further would exceed Eden's current capabilities, especially since our main force hasn't returned yet, Helen reminded her husband, who was somewhat smug. The Grand Duke said, "Oh, of course, I'm not one to be blinded by victory. Having a buffer zone is already quite good." Helen suddenly hesitated, stammering. "What's wrong, my dear? What's there to be nervous about in front of me?" The Grand Duke placed his left hand on his wife's shoulder. Professor asked me to ask you if your previous promise is still valid." "Of course," Grand Duke Atia Cabre said loudly. "I mean, of course it's valid." There was not a trace of hesitation in his voice. The Cabre family always keeps their word, especially after they saved Eden and its people. Helen looked at her husband with excitement, her eyes clear. "Whatever happens in the future, let's face it together. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels." Chapter 567 Impatience. In stark contrast to the joyous atmosphere in Hyderabad, the capital of the Duchy of Eden, a somber mood prevailed in Nisburg, the capital of the Horned Alliance, another member of the Protestant League. The Horned Alliance had assembled a well-equipped army, joining forces with allied troops who had come to assemble, intending to engage the church's army in a major battle. However, the church's surprise attack from the north, bypassing the main force, disrupted the alliance's plans. The council was deadlocked on whether to continue along the planned route or return to rescue their allies. This disagreement led to the departure of allied troops who had come to support them, returning to their homelands to defend their own. This immediately reduced the size of the frontline forces originally intended for the offensive. In Speaker Marcus's office, a heavy atmosphere filled the small space. Marcus sat motionless in his chair, smoking his pipe, the glow of the burning tobacco flickering in the bowl, mirroring the speaker's unpredictable mood. "Eaton's victory has put us in an awkward position," Councillor Foster, sitting opposite him, broke the silence. "This will shake the position of our alliance leader, and that's not all, my old friend." Marcus pulled a letter from his drawer and handed it to Councillor Foster. "This is a confidential letter sent along with the battle report." Foster hurriedly opened the envelope, his eyes widening after reading just a few lines. What is Cabre doing? Is he acknowledging the legal status of wizards? Has he gone mad? He continued reading. HMPH, I see. The Eden's victory on the battlefield was achieved through the power of wizards. I think the so-called recognition of the spellcaster's legal status is some kind of quid pro quo. Marcus shrugged helplessly. Clearly, judging from the wording of the letter, he's informing us rather than seeking our opinion. Perhaps in Grand Duke Calre's view, informing us in advance with a secret letter so we can prepare for the impact is already showing great consideration for our alliance. Foster frowned and said, as one of the top members of the Protestant Alliance, Eaton's actions will undoubtedly cause a huge uproar, and may even lead some to believe that this is the decision of the entire alliance. Marcus and Foster were furious at their allies' unauthorized actions, but they couldn't blame him. Eaton's situation was already precarious, and the Hornbay Alliance, which should have been their greatest support, was unreliable. In desperation, they chose forbidden power, which was a choice they had to make. Marcus said dejectedly, if this news from Eton gets out, it will completely eliminate any possibility of us making peace with the church. Although they have split into Protestant and Catholic churches, they still believe in the same God. Now that the Protestant side has openly and legitimately accepted wizards, such a disrespectful heresy, it is hard to imagine how furious the church will be. Foster asked with a troubled expression, so? What should we do? Marcus said gravely, we shouldn't respond to the Duke of Eaton's decision for now. We should wait until he makes a public announcement and see how the other allies react. But on the battlefield, we can't wait any longer, we must take the initiative, but our offensive force is a third less than planned, and many allied troops have all fled back. We still have to attack. Send up the reserve forces from the rear, take down 3 or 4 enemy fortresses first, and demonstrate our strength. We can't let Eton get all the credit. The Hornbay Alliance must present a strong image to the outside world, let the enemy know who's in charge in the opposing camp, and let those half-hearted allies see that they are just icing on the cake, not indispensable. He instructed his old friend, Foster, you and I must mobilize those counselors who share our views to strengthen our position. We need to make those with ambiguous stances understand that if we continue to waver like this, the Alliance's leadership will be in jeopardy. Marcus Foster nodded heavily. Marcus, you're right. I'll do my best. In Sigidus, on the front lines where the Hornbay Alliance army and the Apostolic Guardians were locked in combat, the army commander, Sharuba Vasquez, inspected the defenses with Senator Horace, who had come to deliver orders. Accompanying them was Senator Foster's second son, Quill Foster, who had been drafted into the army. Finally, they climbed the temporary wooden tower used for observing enemy movements. Senator Horace shielded his eyes with his hand, gazing at the Apostolic Guardian's fortress not far to the east. The walls were built of massive stones, sturdy and tall, equipped with ballistae, catapults, and falling rocks, all sorts of defensive equipment. As for the outside of the fortress, concentric trenches surrounded it. Although they were not clearly visible, it was easy to imagine that the trenches were filled with spikes. Senator Horace hissed incessantly, as if his mouth were full of sores. Although he was a proponent of war, seeing the heavily fortified enemy stronghold still brought back vivid images of the horrific siege. Finally, he frowned and said to the general beside him, General Vasquez, the council has reached a consensus, demanding that the army win 1 or 2 victories, no matter how difficult. A flicker of displeasure crossed General Vasquez's eyes. These useless cowards, stuck in the rear, were only now producing a final decision. He painfully recalled how the council's indecisiveness over whether to launch an attack or rescue their allies had left the frontline troops confused and hesitant to act. General Vasquez had advised an immediate attack, if they could inflict heavy losses on the papacy's forces here. The detachment that had bypassed the north would have to be redeployed to support the main battlefield, naturally resolving the Allies' crisis. Now, things are really messed up. The opposing army has taken advantage of this time to leisurely build fortifications, and a large number of Allied troops have deserted, making the siege exponentially more difficult. Sigh, perhaps I should have ignored the wrangling at home and ordered an attack directly, General Vasquez thought. But if he were given the chance again, would he dare to issue such an order? The Hornbay Alliance punishes military commanders who act without authorization quite severely. I will resolutely carry out Nisberg's orders, General Vasquez said. I just hope that this situation of not knowing whether to advance or retreat will not occur again in the future. In these special times, orders from the highest levels should be efficient and accurate, not leave the troops idle while they argue amongst themselves, preventing them from taking any independent action and wasting valuable opportunities. I will convey your opinion to the council, Horus awkwardly agreed. Chapter 568 Siege. Quiller Foster carefully polished his longsword. This weapon, entrusted to him by his father, was finally going to be used, not for dueling with others, but to take the lives of the enemies he was about to face. Yesterday afternoon, General Sharuba Vasquez, the supreme commander of the Allied forces, issued the order to attack. That night, cattle and sheep were slaughtered in the camp, and the entire army feasted. After a night of rest and recuperation, the battle began at dawn. The Allied forces' first task was to overcome the 3 trenches surrounding the papacy's fortress. For this, they had prepared special chariots for filling the trenches with earth. The chariots were equipped with defensive shields, and their sides and tops were covered with cowhide to protect the soldiers from enemy arrows as they advanced. Once pushed to the edge of the trench, the earth and stones loaded on the chariots were thrown into the trench. 20 such chariots were prepared in total. The enemy defenders, of course, wouldn't stand idly by and wait for their defenses to be breached. A barrage of arrows, crossbows, and catapults rained down on the advancing trench-filling chariots. The losses exceeded the Allied forces' initial estimates. By the time the first trench was filled with earth and stones, creating 3 relatively wide passages, 8 chariots had been lost. When the second trench was passable, only 2 chariots remained, along with hundreds more dead or wounded. General Vasquez, his face grim, ordered the second plan to be implemented. Large numbers of prisoners, and many unfortunate civilians, gathered from the rear carried sacks full of sand and charged towards the third trench. Queller looked with pity at these poor souls, unsure of their fate. Like ants carrying loads, they swarmed towards the trench, constantly struck by arrows and stones, some unable to rise again, others struggling to avoid being trampled by their comrades behind them. Finally, some lucky men reached the edge of the third trench. They threw down the sandbags they had carried along and immediately began running back. These men were fortunate. Throwing away a sandbag meant their punishment would be lessened. While the defenders concentrated their fire to prevent the third trench from being filled in, Vasquez organized men to widen the passage through the first 2 trenches. Eventually, a section of trench about 200 yards long in front of them was wide enough for a large force to pass through. "It's our turn." Queller's face hardened as he pulled his visor over his head. "Son." General Vasquez was right beside Queller. He pressed down on Queller's shoulder and embraced him, the clanging of their armor echoing loudly. "Your father and I will be proud of you." Vasquez had known Queller's father, the Marcus Foster, for a long time, and he regarded Queller as his own nephew. Queller glanced at General Vasquez, nodded silently, and turned to find his men who had been preparing for some time. He quickly joined them and set off with their assigned siege engines. Their target was about 20 meters to the right of the fortress gate. The troops responsible for scaling the walls were all clad in fine armor and carried their most favored weapons. They were all highly skilled noblemen or professional warriors. Although they were assigned siege engines, they didn't have to push them themselves. A group of menial soldiers did that work, shouting loudly as they pushed the siege engines step by step, laboriously advancing towards their target. The siege engines used by the Hornby Alliance army were tower-like structures with 3 wheels on each side of the base for movement. While the menial soldiers didn't have proper armor, shields were mounted on the pushers on either side of the siege engine to protect them from incoming arrows. As for Queller and his men, they crouched low behind the siege vehicle, holding their round shields high, and followed it step by step. Along the way lay the bodies of those who had perished while filling trenches. Some lying on the ground seemed still alive, reaching out to the attacking troops for help, but at this crucial moment, no one paid them any attention. Queller tried to ignore the cries of agony he heard along the way, focusing his attention on the road ahead. Arrows fired from the fortress clanged against the siege vehicle, pounding into the hearts of everyone behind it. If it weren't for that tall vehicle blocking their way, he and his companions would have been riddled with arrows, wouldn't they? Queller thought to himself. The terrifying battlefield environment made it impossible to calmly estimate time. He didn't know how much time had passed when a loud crash was heard. The footplate on top of the siege vehicle had fallen. Beneath the footplate was a pickaxe-like device. After the footplate fell, this pickaxe firmly gripped the crenellations, keeping the siege vehicle pressed tightly against the city wall. In this state, the enemy would have no way to remove the siege vehicle in a short time. Kill! At the sound of the ramp striking the city walls, Queller immediately drew his longsword and shouted, "For victory! For our allies! For all those who have endured the church's injustice, charge!" Before his words had even finished, he was the first to leap onto the ladder of the siege engine, shield in hand, sword raised, a look of unwavering resolve. Quiller's men, inspired by the atmosphere he created, also charged forward, weapons in hand. The top of the siege engine had a square opening connecting to the ladders below. Quiller used this opening to reach the top of the tower-like structure, then strode across the ramps already attached to the city walls. He quickly encountered someone who tried to stop him, a soldier of the church's guard, wielding a spear, the sharp tip thrusting fiercely at him. With his strength spared, Queller didn't want to actively test the defensive effectiveness of his armor. He dodged the spearheads, then pressed his shield to his chest and charged forward at breakneck speed. His original weight plus the armor was probably around 250 to 260 pounds, and the impact was terrifying. The Protestant soldiers gathered near the assault point were almost scattered by his charge. One soldier struck by the shield even fell unconscious. Taking advantage of this precious opportunity, Queller immediately continued his advance, making way for his brothers behind him, but this time he wielded his long sword. Within moments, he had inflicted horrific wounds on at least 3 men. The defending soldiers weren't all weaklings who had just been nearly scattered. Soon, well-equipped elite Protestant soldiers, no less capable than Quellers, arrived and engaged the Protestant army already on the walls in a chaotic melee. For a time, shouts of battle, screams, and the clashing of swords and armor filled the entire section of the wall, a deafening cacophony. Chapter 569 Official representatives stationed in Jiaoan. Old Ford, the head of the State Council, and Cecil, the head of the Intelligence Department, sat on the sofa in Paul's office. Several resumes were laid out on the Lord's desk, and Paul was also holding one, carefully examining it. Old Ford said, "Lord Gleman, these are the candidates we recommend for you. Please make the final decision." Their purpose in being here today was to work with Paul to select an official representative for Lacquer Town stationed in Horn Bay, in order to strengthen official ties with the various countries of Horn Bay. After the opening of the shipping route to Horn Bay, communication between Northwest Bay and Horn Bay was primarily conducted by private merchants. While an envoy from the Horn Bay Alliance, the eldest son of the Marquis of Foster, had come to purchase weapons from Northwest Bay, apart from Quay commanding the Southern's maiden voyage to Horn Bay, no one else had represented Lacquer Town on any such mission. It was all up to the merchants themselves. Enterprises under the State Council did send representatives to Horn Bay, but that remained at the private level. Lakeside Town now has a pressing need for Cape Bay. For example, they might purchase or lease land to provide a foothold, supply depot, and shelter for their merchants affected by the Cape Bay War. Furthermore, since mercenaries are being sent to Cape Bay, it would be ideal to build a fortress there as a military base. It was at this point that Paul realized he lacked a sufficiently influential representative in Cape Bay. Given that most of the officials selected by the State Council through examinations had never been to Cape Bay, the State Council suggested that Paul choose a representative from among the private merchants. Jared John, sir, this is our ceramics factory's business representative in Cape Bay. He's very familiar with the upper echelons of the Cape Bay Alliance. The dignitaries there greatly admire our porcelain. He's a bit old. It might be too much for him to be constantly traveling between countries. So, this Stevie Paredes, sir, he's from the Flanders shipyard, sent to Cape Bay to recruit talent. Then he should be very familiar with the shipbuilding industry there, and talent recruitment is a very important task. Let's leave him alone. Paul looked at several documents, but he wasn't satisfied until he picked up the last one. Friedrich Lister, oh, sir, this is the business representative of Todd Shipping Company stationed in Horn Bay. Todd Shipping Company has a very wide range of shipping businesses, and he often travels between the countries of Horn Bay for business. Paul looked at the resume, raising an eyebrow. This one seems quite good. He is very familiar with the officials, civilian forces, and all levels of society in the countries of Horn Bay, and he is young and energetic. Old Ford and Cecil exchanged glances. This was the last candidate, and the Lord was quite satisfied. It seemed to be him. Paul asked, I just don't know what this Lister's attitude is towards Lacquer Town. Cecil said, his attitude towards Lacquer Town is unknown for now, but he speaks highly of Lord Gleman himself. Oh? How so? Paul became interested, a smile appearing on his face. Haha, so he has fans after all? Cecil explained, We investigated his correspondence with his friends and discovered that this lister has been studying your many economic initiatives over the past few years, such as the support policies for industry and commerce, the reform of the tax system, and especially the establishment of the customs union and the creation of a single market. Lister has praised you highly, his words filled with extreme admiration. Moreover, he has written a book summarizing your policies and is currently commissioning a friend to find a printing press in Arda to publish it. The title is yet to be determined, and several options are tariffs, markets, and government intervention, several stages of the rise of lagging economies, political economy. Before Cecil could finish speaking, he and Old Ford both noticed that the Lord's previously relaxed eyebrows twitched violently. The atmosphere in the office suddenly became much stranger. This book shouldn't have started printing yet, right? Paul asked with a strange smile, but in a sinister tone. Cecil, unsure which sensitive spot his introduction had touched on for the Lord, stammered, not yet. The latest news I have is that the book is still under review. This is something you personally stipulated. Any publication must be reviewed before it can be published. But what? Because it doesn't involve any specific sensitive technical information or statements opposing you, and it's praising you highly. I think the review will be passed quickly. Is the book very detailed? Cecil thought for a moment and said, it's said to be several hundred pages thick, rich in detail, with abundant data, listing a large amount of statistical data, all of course, collected from publicly available information. Paul sighed heavily, then said firmly, immediately terminate the review of this book, allow it to be published directly. No. Send the manuscript to me, I want to see for myself what this Mr. Lister has written. Cecil replied, I understand. Old Ford, the head of the State Council, asked hesitantly, then, Lord Gleman, should this Friedrich Lister, should he be controlled? Or should we? He made a cutting motion with his hand. Although Old Ford didn't quite understand why Paul reacted so strongly, he was certain that Lister had violated some taboo of the Lord. Seeing Old Ford's actions, Paul was speechless. When would his men ever break free from that Game of Thrones mentality, always ready to fight and kill, even wiping out entire families? Couldn't they be a little more civilized? Paul shook his head and ordered, I'm very interested in this Friedrich Lister. We'll tentatively appoint him as our official representative in Horn Bay. Huh? Old Ford and Cecil were quite surprised. The Lord's reaction just now was as if Lister had stolen his underwear. How could he suddenly be entrusting him with such an important task? I think he's a talent, someone who likes to delve deeply into the essence of society and economics. Such a person should certainly be recruited. It's a real waste to have him serve as a business representative for a private company, Paul explained to Old Ford and Cecil, revealing his special regard for Lister. However, I hope he can return to Northwest Bay and meet with me. I have so much to say. Never mind, the situation in Cape Bay is so chaotic. He has many things to do now that he's become my representative, and a trip back would take up a lot of time. Paul thought for a moment and said, well then, I'll write him a long letter. Chief Steward Ford, Cecil, he looked at the two men and ordered. You must send men to his side to assist and support him, and at the same time ensure that he faithfully carries out my orders. Chapter 570 The mercenaries return to Corner Bay. At the end of 1995 in the Holy Calendar, two pieces of news spread wildly throughout the Horn Bay region, especially in the coastal countries. The first was that the Duchy of Eton had independently repelled the papacy's northern offensive, even pushing them back beyond its borders, a feat achieved while the main force of the Eton army had not yet returned home. The second was that the Horn Bay Alliance army on the eastern front had finally captured the fortress of Sigidus, which had been blocking their path, and was advancing deep into enemy territory. Rumors circulated that the Alliance army had suffered heavy casualties in this battle, but the Nussburg authorities vehemently deny this, stating publicly that there were fewer than 1,000 casualties. After a series of twists and turns, Friedrich List finally returned to Nussburg, the capital of the Horn Bay Alliance. As the capital of the largest power in the Horn Bay, it was relatively the safest place, and as a port city, it would be easier to escape by sea in case of any emergency. Because of its distance from the front lines, Nussburg remained peaceful and prosperous after the departure of its soldiers. For those not directly involved in the war, the news from the front provided ample fodder for conversation. On the other hand, the Church's years-long witch hunt had severely suppressed people's speech and lives. However, after the coastal states, led by the Horn Bay Alliance, turned against the Church, all the previous constraints vanished overnight. Everyone happily flocked to taverns to eat, drink, and boast without restraint, making Eastburg's streets and alleys more vibrant during this period. Lister was currently in a tavern in the port area, surrounded by 3 men dressed as warriors. "Well then, thank you for your escort. Let's part ways after this drink," Lister said, raising his glass to the 3 men. "No need to be polite, Mr. Lister. We must live up to the commission you've given us. We are honest," said Raja, a man with a full beard. He and the other 2 raised their glasses to clink with Lister's, and the 4 of them drank their wine in one gulp. Lister asked curiously, "So, what are your plans for the future, you 3? Raja glanced at his 2 companions and replied, "The 3 of us are planning to become mercenaries for now." Before he could finish speaking, a man at the nearby table suddenly stood up and called out to them, "Mercenaries? Are you going to become mercenaries?" The man approached, and Lister recognized him. He was a slightly overweight middle-aged man with a round face and a pair of gold-rimmed round glasses. He wore an exquisitely crafted silk robe and appeared to be from a wealthy family. Lister didn't interrupt. Raja looked at the man and said, "Oh, my 2 brothers and I do have that plan. May I ask who you are, sir?" The middle-aged man bowed slightly to them and said, "Let me introduce myself. My name is Sung Madhobe. I am a middleman, specializing in arms sales and military recruitment." "Oh, so you are Master Madhobe?" Raja poured him a glass of wine in greeting. Madhobe brought the wine himself. The 2 men shared a drink, and the broker, named Sung Madhobe, said, "I have connections with the leaders of all the major mercenary groups in Horn Bay, especially those within the Horn Bay Alliance. If you want to become mercenaries, I can be your introducer and guarantee you'll find a team you're satisfied with." His words piqued Raja and the others' interest, and they quickly struck up a conversation. Madhobe was very skilled at conversation. After a few sentences, it seemed like they had known each other for a long time. Lister, left standing to the side, felt a bit bored and thought he should leave. Just as he was about to stand up to say goodbye, he suddenly saw Sung Madhobe staring wide-eyed. "My goodness! Is today my lucky day?" Madhobe's eyes were fixed on the tavern entrance. Lister followed their gaze and saw a group of people who had just entered looking for seats. "Hey! Over here, look here. Ferguson, Doug, do you still recognize me?" Sung Madhobe. Madhobe jumped up and down, waving his arms incessantly at the group that had just entered. His actions attracted the attention of the group that had just entered, who turned their gaze to Lister's table. 2 of them, upon seeing Madhobe, brightened up. He seemed to be the 2 old acquaintances Madhobe had mentioned. The 2 whispered to their companions for a while, then walked over to Lister's table with their group. "Madhobe, I never expected to see you here," Doug, the leader of the Black Dog mercenary group, said in surprise. "Haha, I thought you'd already been killed by your creditors," Ferguson, the leader of another mercenary group, said sarcastically. "Don't talk nonsense, I've already paid off my debts," Madhobe said with a grin. "But you guys, I haven't heard from you in the last 2 years. I remember your last mission was to, yes, the Northwest Bay." Ferguson suddenly turned hostile, and with lightning speed, he reached out with both hands, grabbed Madhobe's exquisite silk robe, and lifted him off the ground. "It's all because of the good business you introduced that I've been mining coal in the Northwest Bay for 2 years. Do you know how I've been living these past 2 years? My mouth is practically watering." Ferguson's fleshy face twitched, looking like he wanted to devour Madhobe whole. Master Madhobe, Madhobe's servants, who had been sitting at the table, rushed over. It's all right, Madhobe, whom Ferguson had lifted up, remained calm, still grinning, waving his servants away. "Ferguson, I'm just the introducer. Once you went to the battlefield, you entrusted your fate to the Lord of Light. What happens after that is none of my business. Didn't you accept that when you became mercenaries?" But seeing that Ferguson still wasn't going to let him go, Doug also looked on with amusement. At this moment, one of Ferguson's companions spoke up. "All right, Ferguson, don't cause trouble." Ferguson reluctantly put Madhobe down. A single sentence had actually made the previously unruly mercenary leader obedient, prompting Madhobe to cast a curious glance at the man. He smiled and asked, "Sir, my full name is Sung Madhobe. May I ask how I should address you?" The man smiled faintly and replied, "My name is Bogdan. I was sent by Doug and Fergus's employer to accompany them." Chapter 571 The mercenaries return to Corner Bay 2. Bogdan, or rather Jeremy Irwin, Bogdan being his alias in Horn Bay, was a senior staff officer in the Alda Army's General Staff, and also an instructor at the Gleman Military Academy, holding the rank of major. He was appointed as the mercenary supervisor, leading a group of Gleman Military Academy faculty and students to Hornbay alongside the mercenaries. Chief of Staff Schroeder praised Erwin for his calm and strategic approach in the face of adversity, personally appointing him to lead the southward expedition. Besides managing the mercenaries, Erwin's mission included leading the Gleman Academy members to investigate and study the military forces of the Hornbay nations, including their organizational structures, human resources, combat styles, and weaponry. This wasn't because Lacquer Town harbored any ill intentions towards Hornbay, but rather because studying these things was inherently the responsibility of military academies. Now, with the Hornbay War as a readily available case study, it was essential to utilize it effectively and hone their skills. "It's a great honor to meet you, Lord Bogdan." Sung Mabe stepped forward and shook Erwin's hand warmly, as if they were old friends. Erwin smiled and nodded at him, while Ferguson and Doug gave Mabe a disdainful snort. "I wonder which lord hired the black dog in the rhinoceros. Let me guess, it must be some big shot from the Northwest Bay, right?" Mabe recognized their accents from their origins. In recent years, merchants from the Northwest Bay of the Kingdom of Waldo had flocked to Hornbay to do business, and Mabe, with his extensive social connections, was naturally familiar with their accents. "The lord I serve is Earl Paul Gleman, Lord of Arda," Erwin replied with a smile. Although their personal identities needed to be kept secret, their allegiance to any faction was not. Lister, sitting to the side, brightened up upon hearing this. "My God! By the Lord of Light," Madhelbay's expression was exaggerated, his mouth forming an O. "I've confirmed it, today is my lucky day." He looked overjoyed, as if he had found some treasure. "I've heard so much about Earl Gleman. Legend has it he was a great inventor and an invincible commander. Porcelain, paper, canned goods, printed books, sailboats without oars, all came from this Earl, right? Oh, and it's said he also wiped out the pirates who had plagued the territory for years and defeated the evil lord next door. Are these rumors true?" "Oh, basically, they're all true." Erwin was somewhat surprised. Had the lord's reputation already spread throughout Hornbay? This is quite understandable. Merchants from the Northwest Bay were able to make their fortunes in Hornbay thanks to Earl Gleman. The ability to sail the oceans, open new routes, and avoid competing goods were all thanks to the Earl. It's only natural that the merchants admired him, and when discussing their lord with the locals, they couldn't help but praise him. So, what is Earl Gleman doing hiring black dogs and rhinoceroses to Hornbay? Is there anything I can do to help? Upon learning that the man's boss was Paul Gleman, Madhelbay made a decision to forge a strong friendship with him. "To be honest, I have quite a few connections and influence in Hornbay. If you need anything, feel free to come to me. You can ask Ferguson and Doug if you don't believe me." Erwin looked at the two mercenary leaders. Doug nodded and said, "Lord Bogdan, this guy is indeed quite well connected, but be careful not to get ripped off on the price. Honest and fair, honest and fair. I, Madhelbay, value integrity above all else in my business." Madhelbay vigorously promoted himself. "Thank you, Mr. Madhelbay," Erwin said. "I will consider your request if I need it. Count Gleman sent us to Hornbay primarily to protect the safety and property of his people. We don't want to get involved in too many trivial matters, is that so?" Madhelbay said happily. "This kind of work involves dealing with many different people, and I think we'll definitely have opportunities to cooperate." Also, Madhelbay cautiously looked around, then gestured to Erwin, saying, "Please sit at my table, I have some inside information to share with you." Erwin nodded. He was curious what this clearly well-informed local native would tell him. Madhelbay gestured to Raja and Lister, then led Erwin and the others to his table. After learning that the newcomers were from the Northwest Bay, Lister decided to stay. They were still acting under orders from Lord Gleman, and he decided to get to know them after their conversation with Madhelbay. It would be good to have another fellow countryman in this foreign land. Raja and the other two, who were sitting with him, decided to ask Madhelbay about some mercenary groups later, so they stayed and waited with Lister. Madhelbay, having ordered drinks for his new friends, looked at Erwin mysteriously and said, "Lord Bogdan, I wonder if Black Dog and Rhino have any spare capacity for tasks other than protecting assets." "What do you mean?" "Oh, sir. Black Dog and Rhino were once among the top mercenary teams in Hornbay. It's a waste to only have them do security work." Madhelbay said this with a regretful expression. I have a lucrative opportunity to introduce you to. Have you heard? Right, you're new here, so you probably don't know. The Allied forces won a great victory at the front, that's the news, but the reality is it was a Pyrrhic victory. The troops suffered heavy losses and desperately need reinforcements. The council is currently busy contacting people like us to find mercenaries for them. Is that so? Erwin replied casually, already knowing what the other was about to say. Look, I just received the commission and randomly went into a tavern to have a drink, and I ran into Ferguson and Doug. Isn't this God's arrangement? Madhelbay danced with joy. So, as the employer's representative, if you can give Black Dog and Rhino more tasks, you can get a lot of money from the council. Chapter 572 Appointment. Although Madhelbay's words made Doug and Ferguson's eyes light up, Erwin rejected his offer without hesitation. I'm very grateful to have told you this, Erwin said with a smile, but we won't do anything unnecessary until we receive clear instructions from Earl Gleman. Oh, that's a bit too. Madhelbay looked regretful. He couldn't very well go all the way to the Northwest Bay to see Earl Gleman. So he looked at Ferguson and Doug. Since Erwin disagreed, Ferguson and Doug shook their heads firmly. Madhelbay, Doug explained, Lord Gleman's hiring of us is essentially making us his subordinates. In other words, he's our boss now, and we can't disobey his will. Madhelbay listened, then stared at them thoughtfully for a moment. I understand. When he introduced these two mercenary groups to the job in the Northwest Bay, the employer wasn't Paul Gleman, but a nobleman named Kent. Considering Ferguson's claim of mining coal for 2 years, it seemed these two had suffered a defeat and been captured, then conveniently joined Lord Gleman's side. You've certainly found yourselves a good boss, Madhelbay laughed heartily, patting each of them on the shoulder. Madhelbay's laughter made Ferguson and Doug blush slightly. He was also from Horn Bay. He wondered if Madhelbay had guessed that they were now Lord Gleman's slaves. Madhelbay drank another cup with him and said, since you're sticking to your original mission, I won't insist. But I still look forward to cooperation in other areas, which I believe will happen sooner or later. I have business to attend to, so I'll take my leave now. I've already paid for your drinks, you can drink to your heart's content before you go. He stood up, bowed slightly, and slowly walked away with his servants. Aren't you going to catch up with that man? Lister asked Raja and the other two after seeing Madhelbay leave. They seemed quite interested in this middleman earlier. I don't think we need his introduction. We already have a target. Raja looked at Doug and Ferguson, his eyes shining. I also wanted to get to know those fellow countrymen. Let's go say hello together. He had overheard Bogdan's words earlier. It seemed the Lord had sent mercenaries to protect them, the merchants still holding out in Horn Bay. Thank God. Thank Earl Gleman. We are truly grateful. With these two mercenary groups dedicated to specific missions, at least some unscrupulous individuals would have something to consider when plotting something bad. Lister led the three men to Erwin's side. Hello, this must be Lord Bogdan, right? Hearing someone address him, Erwin became somewhat wary, then noticed the man's fluent Northwestern Alder accent. He looked at Lister and asked kindly, is this gentleman also from the Northwest Bay? Yes, Lister bowed. My name is Friedrich Lister, and I'm the business manager for the Todd Shipping Company in Horn Bay. I thank the Lord of Light for arranging this, allowing me to meet a fellow countryman in a foreign land thousands of miles away. Friedrich Lister? Todd Shipping Company, is that Todd Shipping Company? One of the men next to Erwin muttered quietly, and everyone else looked surprised, except for the two mercenary leaders. Lister noticed that it seemed his name had piqued their interest. What, have you heard of me? As for Todd Shipping, that was indeed our company's former name. What a twist of fate, the man who had spoken earlier exclaimed, standing up. He smiled at Lister and said, it's fortunate that I meet you upon disembarking, Mr. Friedrich Lister. I am Dennis Mickford, an official in the Council of State. Unlike Lord Bogdan, who commands the mercenaries, I came to Horn Bay specifically for you. For me? Lister was quite surprised. Before he could recover from his astonishment, the man said something even more shocking. Congratulations, Mr. Lister. Our Lord, Earl Paul Gleman, has appointed you as his representative in Horn Bay. From now on, his will be conveyed to the kingdoms of Horn Bay through you. Here is a letter of appointment, please take it. Lister, dumbfounded, stammered, unable to utter a complete sentence. Was he dreaming? His mind was reeling. Mr. Lister? Mr. Lister, he only recovered from his shock after being called several times. Please take your letter of appointment. Yes, Yes, he took the letter and eagerly opened it. Yes, it did indeed appoint him as the official representative of Lacquer Town stationed at Horn Bay, stamped with Count Gleman's seal. Good heavens! But my previous job, Lord Lister, good heavens, even he was being addressed with respect. You have 2 weeks to organize your previous work. If all goes well, the new business manager appointed by Todd Shipping Company will arrive in Niceburg to take over your duties in 2 weeks. The company has already made arrangements? That's perfect. Lister, being a man of the world, quickly regained his composure. He remembered that Lacquer Town had never had any official figures or groups operating in Horn Bay, which explained why the entire government couldn't find a suitable candidate. By the way, shouldn't I take an oath or something? I remember the government's recruitment process for civil servants involves this procedure, like a knight pledging allegiance to his lord. Dennis McFadden nodded. Of course, it's essential. But such a serious event isn't suitable for a tavern. We'll do it for you once we're settled. That's good. I'll take it seriously. Lister was relieved. Raja and his 2 companions watched Lister and McFadden's conversation with great envy. It seemed their former employer had been favored by his lord and given an important position, rising to prominence overnight. That lord was no ordinary man. Sigh, when will they ever be recognized for their talents? Oh, by the way, I have 3 friends here. Lister gestured to Raja and the others behind him. They want to become mercenaries. Since there are 2 mercenary leaders here, could we give them a try and see if they're suitable? Hearing this, Raja gave Lister a grateful look. Chapter 573. Callum stuck out his tongue and licked his slightly chapped lips. On the winter plains, the cold wind lashed at the face like knives, feeling as if it would tear the skin off. Even for orcs, this wind was unbearable. Callum wrapped his fur coat tighter, took the wine flask from his waist, uncorked it, and gulped down several mouthfuls of wine. The alcohol warmed him slightly from his abdomen, preventing him from feeling too cold. Almost there. Soon he would be back at the royal tent. He shook the reins, and his warhorse quickened its pace. Soon he would be enjoying sizzling roasted meat and warm, comforting wine. The thought made his mouth water. He turned and shouted to his troops, "Warriors, hurry! The warm tents await us." Whoa! Whoa! His men raised their arms in response to their leader. Move! The warrior guarding the prisoners lashed his whip across the bodies of those about to become slaves. This Orcish contingent, besides the mounted warriors, also included a large group of prisoners on foot, their arms bound with ropes. They too were orcs. Compared to the warriors, these prisoners were thinly dressed, some bearing wounds, their plight appalling. Yet, their faces showed no resentment or bitterness, they simply obeyed the commands of their handlers, desperately trying to keep up with the horses. The orcs of the grasslands worshipped the strong, a tradition passed down for millennia. They would spontaneously offer their loyalty to those who conquered them by force, but when the conqueror showed signs of weakness, they would unhesitatingly draw their weapons and pounce on their former conqueror, like the changing of the wolf king in a pack. Callum was a young general in the Zarg clan. Tall and strong, he had honed his combat skills in the harsh environment of the grasslands. He was also quick-witted and a fast learner. These qualities earned him the trust of Abar, the chieftain of the Zarg clan. Starting as the chieftain's bodyguard, Callum gradually gained his trust and learned military tactics from him. When Chieftain Abar announced his intention to restore the glory of the Zarg clan and establish a new royal tent, Callum was finally appointed as a centurion. To solidify the authority of the royal tent, Chieftain Abar used both carrot and stick to subdue the surrounding orc tribes. This inevitably involved using force against those who resisted. During these campaigns, Callum became a rising star in the royal tent, rendering invaluable service to Chieftain Abar. The great chieftain was fair. Callum was promoted step by step to commander of 1,000, and recently to commander of 10,000. This meant Callum had become a powerful figure in the royal tent, capable of handling things independently. Great Chieftain Abar only had 5 commanders of 10,000 under his command, including Callum. Callum had just completed the conquest of a tribe and was leading his troops back to the royal tent. After traveling for another half a day, they finally saw the city walls of the royal tent. This new great chieftain Abar, having consolidated his power, broke with the traditional nomadic customs of the orcs and ordered the construction of their own city. Initially, it was just a small, roughly constructed castle, but more and more buildings were constructed around it. With the addition of newly conquered tribes, the population grew, and the area expanded, eventually forming the scale of a town. Of course, The grassland ecosystem couldn't support a large city, and the orcs' current production relied solely on nomadic lifestyles. Therefore, the population of Chieftain Abar's city fluctuated between 40,000 and 50,000, housing the chieftain's direct army, the leaders of conquered tribes, and his shamanic priests, revered throughout the grasslands. Scattered around the town were numerous orc tribes of varying sizes, maintaining the traditional nomadic lifestyle of the grassland orcs. Upon approaching the town, Callum disbanded his army, and the orc warriors returned to their tribes with their spoils and slaves. Although a triumphant ceremony was traditionally held at this time, Callum's expedition deviated from the usual practice of choosing winter. No one wanted to participate in a triumphant ceremony in the biting cold, especially since their wives and children desperately needed their spoils in the harsh winter. Less than 100 orc warriors remained with Callum. They were his personal guard, his men who had served him since he was a centurion. Callum and his men escorted the remaining majority of the prisoners into the town, a gift for Chieftain Abar. The orc town was poorly planned. By human standards, the layout of the buildings was undeniably chaotic. However, a wide, well-maintained avenue led directly to Chieftain Abar's tent. Yes, Chieftain Abar mostly lived in a tent, a sign of respect for tradition, even though his tent was pitched in town. Callum and his men went straight to the tent, where the guards on watch welcomed him and relayed the chieftain's orders, hand the prisoners over to the guards and proceed directly to see the chieftain. After a brief explanation to his men, Callum entered the tent. "Oh, our fledglings have finally returned to their nest," a loud, familiar voice greeted him upon his entry. Inside the chieftain's tent, a roaring fire burned, its warmth making one feel weak in the knees. A whole, cleaned and fattened ox sat on a rack above, and a servant tending to it turned a crank, dripping grease into the flames with a sizzling sound. Callum sniffed. The aroma was simply irresistible. The tent was carpeted with exquisite rugs from human kingdoms. A circle of orc chieftains sat on the floor, each one burly and robust, all trusted confidants of the chieftain. Seated in the main seat facing the entrance was an orc even taller than the others, Callum's vassal, the supreme ruler in the eyes of all orcs, the undisputed king of this plane, Chief Abar of the Zarg clan. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 574 Milk Powder. Chieftain Abar of the Zarg clan was exactly 30 years old this year, the prime of an orc's physical life. He possessed an exaggerated physique, astonishing brute strength, and a mind that was, or rather, cunning. Long, brown hair almost completely covered his face. Some orcs, for aesthetic reasons, would trim their hair like humans, some even shaving off all the hair on their faces, making them resemble a rugged, barbaric human, but Chieftain Abar never did so, letting his hair grow freely, making his already strong body appear even more imposing. "My fledgling eagle," was how Chieftain Abar addressed Callum. Callum had just turned 26 this year, far too young for a commander of 10,000, so Chieftain Abar always called him a fledgling eagle. His youth also drew much criticism, with many gossiping behind his back that he might be the warchief's illegitimate son. However, anyone who heard this knew after a moment's thought that it was impossible, as the concept of illegitimate children didn't exist in orc culture. It was a term borrowed from humans. Another downside was that initially, some doubted his abilities, but Callum's victories gradually silenced them. "My fledgling, come here quickly," Abar called to him. Following the warchief's command, Callum went around the fire pit and came to the warchief. Only then did he notice a small fire burning in front of the warchief, with a clay pot on top, containing a boiling white liquid. A strange man was stirring and adding firewood. He didn't seem to recognize this person. Was he the warchief's new cook? "Look at this," Abar's booming voice echoed through the tent. "I told you Callum would win. That fool Babrika thought he could escape the royal guard's attack under the cover of winter, but my fledglings did things differently, launching an attack in the freezing cold. Sure enough, they were completely unprepared and easily became our prisoners." "Ho ha, Callum reported the victory to him. "Great chieftain, Chief Babrika is willing to offer you his loyalty. As payment for his previous rudeness, he sincerely offers you 500 slaves, 100 of whom are now the strongest warriors in their tribe." The great chieftain was overjoyed and praised, "Callum, well done. Treat those warriors well and make them willing to serve us." Callum placed his hand on his chest and replied, "As you command, great chieftain." Abar pointed to the boiling clay pot. "Callum, I have something very exciting to share with you. A clever little fellow from the Grosso clan, that young man over there named Aru, has invented a new food that can greatly enhance the warrior's long-range combat capabilities." "Oh, what is it?" Callum's interest was piqued. He turned his gaze to the clay pot. He could already smell the aroma wafting through the air. It was milk boiling there. He wondered why the milk was being boiled like that. Couldn't it just be heated a little? Of course, for orcs, the best milk was freshly squeezed, still warm from the start. What about the new food the great chieftain was talking about? Was it being boiled in milk for so long? Ha ha ha, I'll keep you in suspense for now. Abar laughed loudly, and the orc leaders sitting around him all laughed too. It seemed only he, who had just returned, didn't know. Callum wasn't angry, he was a man who could take a joke. So he found a seat and quietly waited to see what would be revealed in the clay pot. The milk inside continued to boil, constantly spraying white steam into the air. Gradually, the milk in the basin dwindled, until finally, not a drop of liquid remained, leaving only a layer of white substance on the inner wall. "Great chieftain," Callum looked at Abar with a puzzled expression. "My fledgling," Abar pointed to the earthenware basin, "see that white stuff? That's Aru's new food. Its name is milk powder." "Oh," Callum looked back at the basin. Quickly, "Aru, give your milk powder to our commander." Abar happily stroked his fur, urging the orc named Aru. Aru carefully scraped the milk powder from the inner wall, placed it in a bowl, and respectfully presented it to Callum. "Please taste it, Lord Callum." Callum stared at the white powder in the bowl, hesitated for a second or two, then extended a finger, dipped some into the bowl, and put it in his mouth. The white powder called milk powder touched his tongue, and his saliva instantly soaked into it, filling his mouth with a rich milky aroma. It tasted pretty good. He picked up the wooden spoon Aru handed him, scooped up a large spoonful, and began to chew. "Great chieftain, is this what's in milk?" "Yes, in my opinion, the essence of milk is this powder. Using the power of fire to remove the water has preserved its essence." "Great chieftain, this is a great invention," Callum exclaimed excitedly. Milk was an important food source for the grassland orcs. Besides drinking it directly, they also made cheese, cream, and brewed milk wine. However, all of these things were difficult to carry, while this powder, milk powder, was undoubtedly very easy to carry, and more importantly, extremely easy to produce. You see, resupplying during long marches and battles is a considerable problem, and the appearance of milk powder was definitely a significant contribution. Imagine, after a long march, warriors could simply take out a bag of milk powder, eat it with water, and immediately restore their strength, without even dismounting their horses. This is much more convenient than letting a herd of cows or sheep to war. "Yes, I think so too," Abar said happily, rubbing his fur. Aru laughed and said, "Great chief, if you add sugar to the milk powder, it will taste even better, fragrant and sweet." "Ha ha ha ha," Abar laughed loudly. "You really have a dream. Even in the human kingdom, sugar is a luxury. You actually want to mix it into milk powder." However, Great Chief Abar's tone changed, a cold glint flashing in his eyes. "This dream will become a reality sooner or later. Sooner or later, all the sugar in the human kingdom will belong to us, just like their other treasures." Chapter 575 Debate 1. Hearing Chieftain Abar's words, everyone in the tent burst into laughter. "Alright, now that Callum has returned victorious, it's time to discuss serious matters." Abar looked at the young orc named Aru. "Well done, lad. I'll reward your tribe with 100 sheep, and you'll receive 30 sheep and a fine horse as a separate reward." The young orc Aru's eyes lit up with joy, and he bowed repeatedly to the chieftain. "Thank you, King of the Grasslands." Chieftain Alba, his excitement was palpable. "Ho ha ha ha. Go." Abar waved him away, and Aru left the tent. Now, only those of high rank and power remained in the royal tent. Alba's previous serene expression was gone, replaced by a grim and cold face. "Eugene, tell me the news you brought back from the Great Forest." "Yes, Great Chieftain," an older orc replied. This was Eugene, who had recently led a caravan to the forest west of the Great Plains to visit his old friend, Chief Asoy of the Blood Bowl orc tribe. Unfortunately, Eugene's face showed a hint of sadness. "Asoy refused our invitation." Before Eugene could finish speaking, a chorus of indignation erupted from within the tent. "Insolence, ungrateful, Great Chieftain, Immediately send troops to punish this old man. Abar's generals vied for their opinions. Alba waved his hand, silencing them. So they refused after all. The chieftain's expression seemed unsurprised. The orcs of the forest have been separated from us for so long, it's not surprising they made this choice. Chieftain, said an orc general with a hideous scour on his face, those rats hiding in the forest have long forgotten their honor and their obligations to the royal tent. It must be because they've spent so much time with those human tribes who also live in the forest, they've picked up their habits. They no longer deserve to be called orcs. Arroyo, Eugene couldn't take it anymore and scolded. To speak of one's own people like that is far too much, especially to speak of a soy like that. He's a hero, compatriots, Arroyo said contemptuously. We consider them comrades, but do they consider us comrades? Fine, since they don't want to be our comrades, then they can be our slaves. Chieftain, Eugene ignored Arroyo and spoke directly to Abar. Although Asoy is somewhat resistant to us, his son, Gunther, secretly asked me to convey his goodwill to you, son. Ha ha ha. Abar laughed. What did this guy say? He said he greatly admires the Zarg clan and the royal tent, and hopes to one day join your ranks. I understand. Abar stroked his chin thoughtfully. There's more good news, Eugene said. The dwarven stonemason clan's exiled prince, Immer Stonemason, is willing to accept our help to reclaim his disinherited right of succession. Oh? That's certainly good news. Abar became happy. But our help won't come without a price, of course. Eugene also smiled and said, he has promised that if we can help him regain his position as clan chief, he is willing to provide us with a passage controlled by the stonemason clan. Oh, inside the tent, some were puzzled, while others were incredibly excited. Good, with a dwarven passage, the towering and majestic Rocky Mountains will no longer be an obstacle for us. Abar's eyes gleamed. Callum asked doubtfully, Great Chieftain, are we being told to go through the dwarven tunnels? He knew that many orcs, with the dwarves' tacit approval, used the mountain tunnels to plunder humans south of the mountains, preventing human settlements from approaching the Rocky Mountains. However, transporting a large army and its necessary supplies in this way was impossible. Ha ha ha, you may not know this, Abar replied. The Rocky Mountains have many very wide valleys, some of which are interconnected, forming numerous natural passages that allow a large army to pass through unimpeded. The dwarves, fearing outsiders would disturb their lives, concealed information about these valleys. If they were to allow outsiders into their territory for some reason, they would deliberately lead them through their tunnels, sometimes bright, sometimes dark, confusing the outsiders. As a result, for centuries, most people have believed the Rocky Mountains to be an impassable natural barrier. Callum was speechless with astonishment after hearing the great chieftain's words. In that case, the so-called Watchers of the Alder Kingdom become a joke. Enemies could appear from their flanks and rear at any moment. Yes, Arroyo shouted, but that's only if we can control those passages. Otherwise, the dwarves won't provoke the humans. He had a feeling of great revenge about to be exacted, and the thought of the human Watchers' army suppressing the orcs of the plains for centuries filled Arroyo with rage. Abel said, I think it will happen soon. The key is when that Immer will make up his mind. Eugene added, he said he contacted us after returning from the human kingdom. Abel asked suspiciously, what was he doing in the human world? Eugene replied, Immer took a job as a guide, leading a human adventure team back to their homeland south of the mountains. Tisk, greedy dwarves. Abel shook his head and turned to another orc. Augure, my son, tell me about the situation of the humans in Gabella. Yes, father, Augure, Abel's eldest son, replied respectfully. The conflict between the two princes of Gabella has almost become public. I estimate they'll start fighting soon, and then we'll have a good show to watch. Of course, we won't just sit quietly and watch. Oh? Which prince do you think will win? Father, I favor the elder brother. He's the eldest son, his maternal grandfather is the powerful prime minister of the empire, and he has the support of a large number of nobles. Augure continued to explain his point of view, but Abel's mind was suddenly occupied by a thought. Why were all the powerful figures around him producing such troublesome children? The Blood Bowl tribe in the forest, the stonemason dwarves in the Rocky Mountains, and the Gabella Empire to the southeast were all like this. Abel glanced at his son, who was still talking incessantly. Augure, my eldest son, don't disappoint your father. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all, see you in the next video.